Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Justice in Communities of Color, a civil rights forum with the Manhattan DA candidates. My name is Austin DeSouza. I am the president-elect of the South Asian Bar Association of New York. I'm very proud to convene tonight's forum on behalf of SABNY, the New York County Lawyers Association, and the National Hispanic Bar Association's New York chapter. Latino Justices Jose Perez recently talked about how the struggle for civil rights in America is a shared struggle, and our predecessors have gained rights because they joined together as people of color. Tonight is about solidarity, and I'm especially proud that this event is co-sponsored by virtually every bar association of color in New York, Latino Justice, the Association of Law Secretaries, and our allies. Now, police and prosecutors are a key part of a criminal punishment system that has been built to cage people instead of tackling complex social problems and funding education, treatment, and alternatives to incarceration. As a society, we've made a conscious decision to pay more, We've made a conscious decision to pay more to keep people in jail and put people in jail than to educate them and to keep them out of jail. We've built a well-oiled criminal punishment system where prosecuting and throwing people in cages for the most minor offenses is a solution to every social problem. Of course, New York's criminal punishment system has a serious racism problem. According to New York government data, in Manhattan in 2019 alone, 81% of adults arrested were Black and brown people, and 91% of them were sentenced to prison. That's after so-called police reform efforts that supposedly ended stop and frisk, focused on community policing, and stopped prosecuting so-called quality of life crimes. That's because the criminal punishment system is producing the exact results that it was designed to produce, criminalizing poverty and criminalizing color. DAs are integral to how the system runs because they take the people's moral authority and use their discretion to bring charges and punishment. It's because communities of color are so disproportionately impacted by criminal laws that we need to examine the punishment system and ask DA candidates tough questions. I've organized tonight's event, and in doing so, I reached out to all the major political parties asking whether they're running primary races. While only one party has a primary on June 22nd for Manhattan DA, I want to remind everyone that whichever candidate the Democrats elect, they will face off against recently announced Republican candidate Tom Caniff, a civil rights attorney, and potentially other candidates in the November general election. So tonight we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to ask the candidates where they stand on disciplining DAs who have wrongly convicted innocent people and made them rot in cages for half their lives. Where do they stand on qualified immunity for DAs who abuse their office and violate the public trust? How are they going to change the perception of DAs as just cops with law degrees? What about caging humans without a trial? Before any evidence is brought against you and simply because you cannot afford to pay cash bail. We literally say that you're presumed innocent until you've been found guilty, but then we put you in a cage before trial as though you're guilty. The Manhattan DA's office is also one of the richest DA's offices in the country. Do the candidates want to fund public defenders and 18B attorneys at the same rate as prosecutors? When will we finally stop talking about restorative justice and build a process focused on keeping people out of jail? Tonight's panel of experts will also be touching on other important issues, including immigration enforcement, decriminalization, hate crimes against Asians, LGBTQ+, and other vulnerable communities. Each candidate will answer questions from our panel for 15 minutes, then take 7 minutes of questions from our audience, and have 3 minutes for closing statements. If you have a question for a candidate, please write it in the chat and I will communicate that to our panelists. Now on to our panelists and speakers. You'll find full biographies in the event program, but let me briefly introduce our panel. Our moderator is Xavier Donaldson, who is so well known in New York, in the New York legal community, that he barely needs an introduction. But Mr. Donaldson is a star in the criminal defense bar, a senior trial attorney and founding partner of Donaldson and Chiliest, and a former Bronx assistant district attorney. He's a frequent lecturer on criminal law, a former president and director of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association, and a nationally broadcast legal analyst on TV and radio. I'd be here all night if I had to list all of his accomplishments, so please check out his full bio in the event program. Amelia Green is also joining us. She's a partner at Neufeld, Schreck & Bruston, LLP, a premier plaintiff side civil rights litigation firm. She has represented victims of unjust conviction and won some of the most complex civil rights cases in New York, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. She earned her bachelor's degree from Columbia University and her law degree from Stanford. Professor Jumtoli Huck is an associate professor of law at City University of New York and the founder and editor of Law at the Margins, a law and media nonprofit focused on law and social justice. She's an expert on immigration rights and labor rights. James Aliaga is an associate at Calterra Pollock LLP and regional president of the Hispanic National Bar Association's New York region. Mr. Aliaga began his career at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, where he worked on general misdemeanors and violent felonies before entering the office's Law Accountability Bureau, where he investigated and prosecuted NYPD officers for misconduct. Before becoming a lawyer, Mr. Aliaga was prosecuted as a juvenile offender in Virginia before moving on to graduate magna cum laude from James Madison University and earning his law degree from NYU. I want to extend special thanks to Mr. Aliaga for helping me organize tonight's event. Our next panelist is Dr. Calvin John Smiley. He is an assistant professor in sociology in the sociology department and faculty member in the Roosevelt House Public Policy Program at Hunter College, City University of New York. He's an expert on the racial impacts of our carceral legal system and recently co-edited a book entitled Prisoner Reentry in the 21st Century, Critical Perspectives of Returning Home, which is a comprehensive and intersectional approach in understanding the dynamics of reentry. Please buy it and read his excellent book. I put a link in the program materials. Kenrick Ross is here. He was recently named the executive director of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, a federation of 60 plus LGBTQ plus API organizations across the United States. He is a tireless advocate for LGBTQ plus rights with an emphasis on immigrant communities of color. And we have my friend, Professor Terence Coffey, who teaches forensic justice at NYU. The criminal justice system has touched Professor Coffey's life in a profound way, as he has spent 19 years in and out of prison. He is now co-founder or has been the co-founder and CEO of Educate, Don't Incarcerate, which works to guide formerly incarcerated students. Every Thursday at 4 p.m., I tune in to his talk show, It's Coffee Time, where he discusses issues related to criminal justice reform. Now, before I turn it over to Stephen Lessard, NYCLA's president, for some brief remarks, I want to take a moment to thank my dear friend, Asha Smith, chair of NYCLA's criminal justice section, for pushing me to turn this idea into reality. Thanks to Geronimo Saldana of Latino Justice for producing tonight's video and opening up our event to a worldwide audience on YouTube. Last but not least, special thanks to NYCLA's own Azalea Cuts for doing the back-end work that never gets recognized enough. I'll hand it over to you, Stephen Lessard.
Thank you, Austin. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event. Over 100 years ago, NYCLA was founded on the principle that everyone should be treated equally under the law. When other bar associations excluded lawyers from membership because of their race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, NYCLA welcomed all qualified members. Throughout its history, NYCLA has adhered to this core value, promoting policies of diversity and inclusion in the profession and equal justice under the law. Despite NYCLA's past efforts to promote diversity and inclusion, we recognize that we cannot rest on our past accomplishments, that we can and should do more. Such action is particularly essential at this moment in time. That is why we are happy to join in events like this one tonight. I particularly want to welcome the organizations sponsoring tonight's event that represent communities of color. NYCLA is excited to partner with you tonight, and it is our hope that we can join together in future collaborations and create an environment of solidarity between our organizations with the goal of improving the legal profession and promoting the rule of law. We hope that the members and leaders of your organizations will also become members and leaders of NYCLA. I'd like to thank Austin D'Souza, James Aliaga, and Asha Smith for their hard work in making tonight's event possible. And finally, I'd like to thank Xavier Donaldson for generously agreeing to moderate tonight's event. Once again, thank you, welcome, and I'll turn the mic over to Xavier.
Xavier, you're going to have to unmute.
I'm unmuted. I'm muted. I'm muting myself. That's not good. Generally, my kids mute me, press a mute button, say dad mute, but I guess I just muted myself. So thank you very much for having me. I want to thank Austin. This is a fantastic event. Thank the National Hispanic Bar Association, the New York County Lawyers Association, great organization, South Asian Bar Association, of course, all the other minority bar associations that have co-hosted or are participating in providing this wonderful event. It's my opinion as a criminal practitioner in New York City and across the state and across the country that we need to pay more attention to district attorney races. It's my opinion that they are probably the most important local races that we have. And so it's my pleasure to be a part of this. I always say, be a part, don't be on the sideline. So if I'm asked, I'm going to participate. We have a stunningly diverse and qualified and great panel. I think all the candidates are pretty good candidates, so I'm anxious to get started. A few rules, people who know me know I like trying to run a good ship here. So as a moderator, I'm going to be very time conscious. So to my candidates, if I tell you, if I do this, that might mean start wrapping it up. So I might do that a few times. That might mean start wrapping it up. So let's get started. Professor Hupp. Our first candidate here is Eliza Orleans. She is, well, everyone knows who she is. Please get started with the questioning and let's get this thing rolling.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll just get right to business. You may have missed the introduction. I'm a professor at CUNY School of Law, and my questions are actually crowdsourced from my colleagues who are all experts in immigration and criminal fields and labor myself. So I just wanted to kind of extend ourselves also as a resource. So if you agree to some of these questions, we're extending ourselves as sort of support. So the first question is, they're yes and no questions, so please just answer them accordingly. As a prosecutor, your decisions have implications for non-citizen defendants. Padilla versus Kentucky, the Supreme Court held that criminal defense attorneys have an obligation to advise non-citizens. Do you agree that prosecutors have a legal and ethical obligation to mitigate and avoid immigration consequences? And there's 4 related questions to that. So.
Well, I have to say hello. Hi, everyone. Nice to see familiar faces. Thanks, everyone, for organizing. I'm Eliza Orleans, the only public defender running for Manhattan DA. And so I am very familiar with what have been my Padilla obligations since the Supreme Court decided that case. And I think, yes, absolutely, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has completely disregarded that case and put the entire burden on public defenders and defense attorneys alike. And so, yes, my answer is yes.
Great. So related to that, since you're familiar with IRIRA, we'll go into the law itself. So to minimize harm to immigrant defendants, would you, 1, decline and commit not to prosecute low-level nonviolent offenses like petty larceny and criminal possession, which are both 8 misdemeanors? That's one question, yes or no?
Yes, They are among a list of cases that I would decline to prosecute.
Great. And I guess related to that, if you would be open to like publishing the list of nonviolent offenses that you would decline to prosecute just for public notice. Just to related to that. Second, would you adopt a written plea policy requiring the consideration of avoidance of immigration consequences and decline to overcharge in any cases where there is a immigration consequence? So adopting a plea policy, I believe the DA in San Francisco did something like this.
Professor Huck, I love these questions. I already have both of those things. I have a declination policy and a plea policy up on my website, elizaorleans.com, and I would of course take into account people's immigration status when charging.
Great, and if you can put that into the chat or in some way for staff, great. And then the last three are really about perspective. But I'll focus just on one in the interest of time. And this comes from my colleague, Talia Peleg. Would you create an immigration integrity unit similar to the conviction integrity unit, using post-conviction remedies and all other sort of tools at your disposal to vacate or to remove any kind of consequences from criminal convictions that create immigration consequences? I don't know if you understand that. Like, it was just basically an immigration integrity unit.
Yes, absolutely. And we will be utilizing that in my wrongful conviction unit, which is going to be much more expansive than one that just focuses on exonerations for cases that are years or decades old. We must be working to vacate convictions and mitigate consequences from convictions. Wrongful conviction needs to have a much broader definition.
But you'd include immigration in that as well.
Definitely, and have plans for a fully staffed immigration unit at the DA's office. Right now, that entirely falls on the defense. And of course, there should be more than, I think there's only one immigration lawyer, correct me if I'm wrong, on staff at the Manhattan DA's office. And that person routinely rejects plea offers that would mitigate immigration consequences for our clients.
Great, thank you so much.
Of course.
Again, sorry, I'm on mute again. I keep thinking about my kids. Professor, thank you very much. Eliza, thank you for those answers. Mr. Coffey, please, you're next. Steve, you're muted as well.
Yeah, let me not do what Xavier just did, and I'll be here. Eliza, it's great to see you here. Thank you for joining us in this wonderful conversation, which is really needed. As you know, I represent the advocacy and Black and brown communities and those individuals who have been directly impacted by our criminal justice system. And a lot of the questions that I'm going to pose to you, I actually formulated from a community base, from kids in our communities. I think you're going to have a host of questions that hit you with the technicals, but I really want to kind of let my voice represent the community voices. And this is from 14-year-old Davis. And he asked, when police do bad things, why don't they get in trouble? Now, I'll follow his question up with mine. The Gothamist, I don't know if there was a Gothamist report that came out recently that reflected that 22 NYPD police officers were convicted of dishonesty, corruption, and misconduct charges, which led to overturning of various cases that they were involved in right here in New York City through the district attorney's office with Eric Gonzalez as well as Cy Vance. Now, I want to let you know I have researched your background. You have a very progressive and aggressive agenda on police misconduct. And I think the question for me and my audience is I'm trying to understand, with such an aggressive agenda, where does the balance between the DA's office and law enforcement that has historically been, kind of two birds of one feather, do you feel that your policies will create a wedge between law enforcement and the district attorney's office?
Well, I'm going to take Davis's question first, which is, why don't the police get in trouble when they do bad things? And I want to say to Davis, as someone who has represented over 3,000 people here in Manhattan who have been charged with crimes, I too ask that question all the time. And it's really because the district attorney's office has failed to hold the police accountable. They don't charge them with crimes, whether they beat someone up, whether they do something that is unlawful, whether they lie under oath. When you walk into court, you have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then even when they lie under oath to a judge or to a jury, they don't get charged with a crime. And that's because we've been electing DAs who've really been working hand in hand with the police in a way that means that they don't hold the police accountable. So to move on to the second part of that question, I think it's really important to say that the Manhattan DA's office has been complicit in the continuing misconduct of the NYPD, has allowed them to operate with impunity because they know they won't be held accountable for their actions, whether it be brutalization and assault and terrorizing of the communities in this city, or whether it be perjury, falsifying of documents, lying under oath, et cetera. So while I take this aggressive stance, I think it's imperative that the next district attorney be committed to holding police officers who do bad things, as Davis says, accountable. And I do understand that there is a cooperative way in which the DA's office and the NYPD work together. And as a public defender, I've many times worked with the police and have brought clients in, have spoken to them, have worked hand in hand with them. And I do think that there are some who want to do their jobs, want to investigate serious crimes, and don't want to be tasked with arresting people who are dealing with substance use disorder or who are experiencing homelessness or who are in the throes of a mental health crisis. But I think that, the primary concern, especially given the moment that we're living through and that people are finally acknowledging the systemic racism that exists within policing and the overwhelming brutality that we've seen, that the next DA be committed to accountability.
Okay. And this ties really into another question that comes from me in relations to Davis and a lot of other communities. How do you, and it was mentioned earlier that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is probably one of the wealthiest in the country that we know. How do you see this office instituting equity within the offices that fund some of the aspects of the district attorney's office that have not been utilized, particularly when we think of the alternatives to incarceration? We have other programs that were there, but were not funded, but more directed towards prosecution. And that's one question. And I think the next one brings me into mind with one of my students who's a big fan of Krasner, as you know. And we kind of want to know, how do you see cleaning house? With what you know about the current district attorney's office now, you're going in on that first day. How do you see cleaning house, and what does that look like for you?
Well, these are really important questions, and it's, when I'm elected to be the next Manhattan District Attorney, it will be on all of the promises that I've made regarding decarceration and the declining to prosecute low-level offenses and the holding people accountable who commit serious harms, but who the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has traditionally turned a blind eye to. And so with all of that in mind, and with these values that I've espoused, it will be my obligation to make sure that the people who are staffing my office are people who share my values. And there are some folks there who are very entrenched, who I've gotten to know over the years as a public defender and seen how they have been some of the most punitive, most carceral, wanting to use incarceration instead of alternatives to incarceration for every single case. And really seeing how that's not only unjust and racist and cruel and inhumane, but it's not keeping our city safe. It's wasting taxpayer money. It's allocating resources in a way that doesn't address the root causes of the issues people are facing. And so I am obligated to, to get rid of executive leadership, management, people who have really perpetuated the devastating harms of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and bring in people who share my values, people who have spent their careers as public defenders, as criminal defense attorneys, as immigration lawyers, as people who have fought against the system and who want to see this systemic change come to that office. And so, yes, the way in which funding must be allocated does reflect our values. And so, you know, when I'm put in that office, it will be with the promise of seeking alternatives to incarceration in every case we possibly can. You know, I've seen and I've represented kids as young as 15, 16, who the Manhattan District Attorney's Office wanted to only send to jail and wanted not to allow them to participate in alternatives to incarceration. And occasionally when we've gotten judges to agree to that, in spite of the DA's office, people have succeeded. I have a young client, Jessica, who succeeded, you know, with flying colors, ended up getting youthful offender treatment on a gun case, and then subsequently was able to, you know, really succeed. She graduated high school. I got to speak at her high school graduation. You know, she has since remained gainfully employed, has a baby on the way. And really, we can do so much when we favor alternatives to incarceration instead of just thinking about this in a punitive way where we just lock everyone up the way the Manhattan DA's office has done.
And my last question, how do you balance with the right, maybe calling you a bleeding heart liberal, to ensure public safety while at the same time upholding a balance of law while in office?
Eliza, you have 1 minute.
Okay.
Answer that question.
Got it. So we've really been sold this false equivalency between public safety and mass incarceration. We've been told that the way we keep people safe is by locking people up. And it turns out, as those of us who've spent our careers as public defenders have always said, that's not true. And now, thankfully, people like Larry Krasner are getting elected. People like Rachel Rollins in Boston are getting elected. And we're seeing these longitudinal studies about what happens when we decline to prosecute low-level offenses. And, you know, the National Bureau of Economic Research put together this study in Boston where Rachel had declined to prosecute these 15 low-level offenses. And they found that when you decline to prosecute these cases, it reduces the likelihood of future contact with the criminal legal system, which means by declining to prosecute these cases, we actually will be making our communities safer. That is how we protect public safety, by keeping people in their homes, allowing them to continue to go to work, allowing them to remain in their families, not locking people up who are presumed innocent but can't afford to buy their freedom. These are critical issues, and we can't allow the media narrative from the right-wing media to call us bleeding hearts, to say that, you know, this is not going to keep us safe, because in fact, it's going to make us safer. Mass incarceration has never provided the public safety that we want, nor will it ever.
Thank you.
Eliza, thank you very much. Mr. Ross.
Hey, Eliza. I'm Executive Director of the National Queer API Alliance. So among the many things that we're addressing is, of course, the tremendous spike in anti-Asian violence in New York, particularly the most vulnerable within the API community, and also that many of the perpetrators have also been vulnerable as well. Among the many solutions that community activists have raised is hate crimes. So my question is, as DA, what would be your approach specifically on charging hate crimes? And in general, how would you approach within the parameter of the DA's office, creating redress for individuals who have been impacted by this level of violence, but also does not make our communities more unsafe? So how would you both keep communities safe and also bring a level of accountability and justice based on these incidents?
Well, thank you for that question. And first of all, this is something that deeply impacts me personally. My sister is adopted, she's Chinese. And so throughout our lives, you know, this anti-Asian racism is certainly not new, but we are seeing an increase in violence. And I worry about her and about my nephew. And it's something that I understand why people feel incredibly concerned about. And I share that concern. I, like the rest of my policies, though, don't think that we address hate with more incarceration or harsher penalties, because the reality is that most of the people, you know, who are perpetrating these things are often people who have been through our criminal legal system, which just shows what an absolute abject failure it has been to begin with. And so, clients of mine who I've represented who are dealing with serious mental health issues have in fact decompensated mentally, have gotten worse while they were held in jail, and then been released, because most people are not being locked up forever, and then ended up reoffending very shortly thereafter. And so, we really need to be thinking about investing in communities, providing communities with the resources they need, and really addressing these issues with thinking about things beyond, in a way that's beyond just additional policing, additional incarceration, additional penalties, restorative justice practices, and thinking about actually addressing these things and calling it out and standing up, obviously, for our vulnerable communities, as I've always done as a public defender, are things that are top priorities to me. But, I'm not going to say, we need harsher penalties or more incarceration, because I just don't think that provides the answer that we want.
Okay. Mr. Ross, do you have another question?
Yes. So how would you communicate that to the communities impacted? Oftentimes, the DA's office seems very alien to the communities that are most impacted by your policies and your discretion. And, for example, what we perceive in a colloquial understanding in public to be hate crimes, for example, is not a legal definition. And oftentimes there's a knee-jerk reaction. So how would you express this more comprehensive approach to safety to the communities that are impacted and traumatized in this moment?
I mean, this is a huge challenge. And I think that, obviously in all circumstances, you have to lead with compassion and humanity and empathy. And that's what I've always done as I've sat across from over 3,000 people charged with crimes here in Manhattan. And I think so many people say, oh, well, you've represented only the people accused of crimes. And what I kind of try to explain to people, which I think is also something that people don't necessarily perceive, which is that so many of my clients, there's a huge overlap between the people who have been victims of crimes and the people who've been charged with and arrested for crimes in this city. And so many of my clients were themselves victims of crimes. And I've consistently fought for the communities in this city who are traditionally the most vulnerable. All of my clients have been lower income folks, predominantly Black and brown people, LGBTQIA folks, people with disabilities, people who have been treated the most unfairly by our criminal legal system. And, someone who has been a victim of a crime is far more likely to end up being prosecuted by our criminal legal system. And so I think that, these are the communities in which I am respected, that I'm known, that I've fought for, and that I've worked in, and that I've stood alongside for my entire career. And so, of course, this is a massive challenge. But as the only public defender in the race, I have the unique experience of having really always been on the right side of this fight.
Thank you very much. Mr. Aliaga, do you have any questions? Maybe one. I think we can squeeze one in.
Yeah, just one that should work.
Yeah.
Hi, Attorney Orleans. As a former juvenile probationer, I appreciate public defenders very much so, and I wish there had been public defenders in my friends' lives in Virginia that work the way that the New York City ones do. Very, very diligent, and it's great to see you in the race. One question I have that kind of piggybacks off of this notion about public safety and specific individuals that get harmed. Inevitably, law and order rhetoric comes back and says, well, what about the victim, right? Why do you want to let people out of jail? Why do you want to take it easy on them with alternatives to incarceration? What about the victim? And as a prosecutor, you're not really representing the victim, but sometimes you do. In rhetoric, sometimes a prosecutor wears the victim as a weapon. It says, well, we're doing justice for the victim. That's why we're going to trial. That's why we're sticking to these certain parts, certain high plea bargaining positions. And then the victim's voice kind of gets lost in the shuffle. From your perspective, if you're the district attorney, should a prosecutor be the voice of the victim? And I say that with the caveat that we all know sometimes victims naturally, emotionally want something that's maybe a little too far, right? We've seen a couple of victims out there who may feel like because they lost a cell phone or they had some kind of injury to them, they want the death penalty or they want 20 years in jail. So there's obviously a tempering there that has to be done. From your perspective, should prosecutors be the voice of victims? And if not, who should?
Well, that's an extremely important issue. And, I think that the conflation of, here are victims over here and here are perpetrators over here that I kind of touched on earlier is something that I would point to when I say that, the district attorney is supposed to be representing the people of the state of New York. That's who they stand up and purport to represent every day. But oftentimes they act in paternalistic ways and decide they know what's best for the victim. They're the ones who want to make all the decisions, whether it be harsher or less harsh than the victim wants to see. For example, a case that comes to mind, and people talk a lot about domestic violence, and they fearmonger around domestic violence. These are scary, bad cases. Well, I represented a young woman, I think she was 17 at the time, and she was accused of having cut the cord of the mouse that plugged into her mother's desktop, something worth probably $12. And she, was alleged to have cut the cord. And this was written up as because they had a familial relationship, a domestic violence criminal mischief. And I went to arraign the case, and the mother was there in the courtroom, and I'm arraigning her daughter, and the district attorney's office says, we request a full order of protection, a temporary order of protection, a full order though, meaning my 17-year-old client would be excluded from her home. And her mother is, of course, in the courtroom in tears, begging the Manhattan DA's office to allow her daughter to come back to her home. And they said, no, we know what's best. This is a domestic violence case. We're going to ask for a full order of protection. And this is something that's just reflexive, that in every case they ask for a full order of protection. So it can't be that there's no listening to the person who actually, but it's like these cases have to be thought of as individualized cases. It can't just be this blanket thing that the DA's office does, which is ask for a full order of protection that effectively makes a 17-year-old child homeless. So,
Eliza?
Sorry, I'm going on too long on this question, but anyhow, these are really important.
No,
it's like, I get,
Wait, I understand. I appreciate it. This is a very, very important topic. But like I said, I was going to do.
Please.
We have a short time period, so I think you have about 2 minutes to do your closing. I think we're giving people 3 minutes to do a closing. Is that right? I think you're going to have 2. So give us 2 minutes of a good closing. Thank you very much for that fantastic answer. Thank you for all your fantastic answers. But we have to do a closing. Professor Huck, sorry, let's get back to you on this. But 2 minutes for your closing, Eliza. Get started.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me today. This is such a phenomenal panel. I feel like I could sit here and talk to you all for hours. I really appreciate the time. And, I do want to expound on the story that I told a little bit earlier. So my 16-year-old client, her name was Jessica, who was charged with gun possession. She had been not attending high school. She had been hanging out with a group of guys who were probably not the best influence. She had recently come out to her family, and like so many LGBTQIA teens, her mother didn't accept her. And she was not street homeless. She was staying with friends or her girlfriend or her aunt or her grandmother, but was, her life had basically been destabilized. And the police were pulling up one day, and one of the guys that she was hanging out with kind of said, "Oh, you're a girl, you won't get in trouble," tossed her a gun, which she was trying to shove in her sleeve as the police officers pulled up on her. And, I remember arraigning her in the Manhattan DA's office, asking for bail that her family would not be able to afford. And she was 16 years old and begged for an alternative to incarceration and youthful offender treatment on the case. And the Manhattan DA's office refused to offer her an alternative to incarceration. Well, finally, thankfully, we came upon a judge who did, have sympathy and said, okay, I will give her this opportunity to engage in an alternative to incarceration. And Jessica attended Bronx Connect, successfully completed, became a mentor to other kids, was just, really, really excelled and re-enrolled in high school. And 2 years later, I got a phone call from her girlfriend saying, "Eliza, we know you're super busy, but Jessica's graduating from high school and it would mean so much if you could be there." So I, of course, attended. I let the judge know. We both ended up speaking at her graduation from Manhattan Comprehensive. And that was 8 years ago. Jessica's been employed ever since. And I attended her baby shower 2 weeks ago. her fiance is pregnant and they're about to have a baby. So, you know, I think Jessica's case, like so many others of mine as a public defender, are really the stories at the heart of what shapes all of the policy positions I take. You know, as the only public defender, I'm the only person who has truly fought in the trenches every day of my career on behalf of human beings and against incarceration. And now I think it's become quite popular to spout these progressive talking points and to say there's systemic racism. We should end mass incarceration. But New Yorkers really need to decide who is not only authentically committed to these things, who's always spoken out about these things, but who has the experience and the knowledge from having practiced in the courtroom in 100 Center Street, you know, who truly understands what it would take to implement these policies. And as the only public defender, I am the only person who can do those things. And I would be honored to receive your support in 49 days on Election Day. And thank you again so much for having me.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you for coming. So thank you all. Thank you, Eliza, for coming. We appreciate it. Next up, we have Ms. Lang. Ms. Lang will be our next candidate who will be speaking to us. Ms. Lang, forgive me, I'm calling everyone by their first name, so I'm calling you Lucy as well.
As you should. I'm happy to see you, and I'm apologizing that due to an idiosyncrasy of scheduling, I'm not on my normal device or in my normal spot, so things are a little wacky here. And there may be children banging down my door, but I'm really happy to be with you.
That's okay. My children are muting me for a
away.
second, so don't worry about it. Children, that's what they do. They knock on doors and mute people. It's fine.
But you have a perfect background setup. You're perfectly framed. So
Do I?
coming over.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's so nice. Thank you so very much. You're so nice. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. So again, Lucy, thank you for coming. Ms. Green will start off our questions. Thank you very much. Ms. Green, please.
Hi, Lucy. My name is Emilia Green. I am a lawyer at Neufeld & Breston, a plaintiff side civil rights firm. And we represent individuals who have been subjected to police misconduct. And I also represent a lot of individuals who've been wrongfully convicted. And so I want to ask you some questions about your position regarding conviction integrity units, and in particular, the conviction integrity program at the Manhattan DA's office. In terms of the conviction integrity program, it at this time has a fairly limited scope, looking at wrongful convictions, many of which are decades old. Are you in favor of expanding the scope of the conviction and integrity program? And in particular, do you agree that it should include reexamination of excessive sentences and review of applications for clemency and recommendations for reduction of sentences, in addition to looking at wrongful convictions?
Absolutely. And thank you for your work. And I'm apologizing because I'm not actually sure even where the camera is on this device. So I'm trying to look you in the eye, but I know that it must look like I'm looking somewhere bizarre on the screen. But yes to all of those things. And as you know, probably better than most people, the conviction integrity unit in the Manhattan DA's office has been far too meager for far too long. And part of the problem is, one, there are too few lawyers staffing it. And two, that unit has basically been vested since its origin, I don't know, less than a decade ago, not just with wrongful convictions, but also with things like the Brady-Giglio disclosures and the Garrett disclosures, and figuring out how to track officers who had adverse credibility findings. And all of that was really too much for what was originally one lawyer, and I think now is two and a half lawyers or something like that. And really, there needs to be a full-time staff just dedicated to conviction integrity in the sense of reviewing past convictions. And there needs to be a separate full-time staff to deal with some of those other police-related issues around tracking, misconduct, disclosures, et cetera. But I think more importantly, and I see this as I shouldn't say more importantly, equally importantly, part of the expansion needs to be around sealing and expungement, around identifying cases where it's appropriate to seek clemency or sentence reduction, and really seeking to use that office that unit of the office as a mechanism for addressing mass incarceration, not just, of course, for identifying wrongful convictions, but for figuring out the tools that are at the district attorney's disposal, either legally or in terms of a bully pulpit, to advocate for reduced sentencing and for clearing people's records wherever possible. So the way I reframe it is really thinking of it more as a retroactive review unit, that it will be a unit that looks back at existing cases, whether there are claims of wrongful conviction, be they factual or legal or not, and seeks to identify ways to shrink the carceral footprint. But I think that another important piece on top of that is that there be mechanisms for creating forward-looking policy as a result of what's discovered through that unit. So that can take the form of sentinel event reviews in the case of every instance of wrongful conviction to evaluate what went wrong, how it went wrong, and make sure that there are policies in place to ensure that it never happens again, and to identify any like cases that may have had similar such failings.
Ms.
Green?
Yes. Thank you.
If you have another question, go right ahead.
Sure. And just to follow up on this kind of same subject area of questioning, I now want to ask you a little bit about Brady officers who have been found or are known to have committed misconduct and have issues with honesty or integrity and prior criminal cases. And do you approve of audits of cases which involve known Brady officers in which the goal is to vacate the conviction of individuals who were convicted on a basis of a Brady officer's testimony? That testimony was material to the conviction without regard to extensive investigation of whether that convicted individual is guilty or innocent.
So are you thinking about something like the Scarcella set of cases out of Brooklyn?
Sure, yeah, but something more broad. So in terms of actually auditing cases, you identify a Brady officer, but going back and looking at their cases, are you in agreement that we should be vacating convictions without regard to guilt or innocent, extensive investigation into guilt or innocence once we know a Brady officer has provided material testimony in a case?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I want to make sure to be thoughtful about it and not say something that is over-inclusive. So what I will say is this, that I intend to create I guess it's what a lot of district attorneys call a transition team that really will be part of the building of the infrastructure of the new office that will include folks from the innocence community and members of the defense bar. And that would not just be leading up to January 3rd, but will be really kind of ongoing to review policy. And so I actually just don't know what the numbers look like of cases facing the office that are in the posture you describe. And so before I say 100% all the cases, I would say, let's you and I sit down together and map out exactly how many cases we're talking about and what the implications would be of just categorically vacating them. Because I think as a matter of fairness, there is an important argument in favor of it. But I also want to make sure that I think about it before committing to you right now, because I just don't know what the numbers look like and what the exact mechanisms would be.
Okay, Ms. Green, I want to interject for a quick second. I'm not going to do this too often, but I have to on this one. So Lucy, I just want to follow up on what Ms. Green is saying. So numbers aside, as a practicing criminal attorney in the city and abroad, if you come across a case, 20 cases, so you have an officer who's testified and we find out that he has testified and there's Brady material or he's testified falsely in a case, and then we look back at his other cases and he's testified materially in those other cases. I guess the question is, what do you do with those other cases that where you have an officer testify on this particular date and he lied under oath and someone got convicted? What do you do with the other cases that he's testified on, the other 10 cases before that one?
Well, I think that's really the question that you're asking, and that's what we'd have to look at. Because I'm thinking of a case that one thing that is on my mind right now is I had a case many years ago in which an officer was discovered, essentially had a mental breakdown and ended up committing a Brady violation after a number of cases in which they were not under mental duress. And so I would just want to know what we're talking about in terms of the kinds of cases. And if I were to say absolutely every Brady violation means you're categorically going to dismiss every case that officer ever touched. I just don't think it would be responsible for me to commit that to you right now, but
Okay.
I do want to keep the conversation going because I imagine that there may be a very coherent policy that we could perhaps agree on this. And of course, the last thing I would ever want to do would be for there to be people who are convicted based on Brady violations, and we have to identify ways to root those out.
One more question that I'm going to go to you, Mr. Smiley. I guess so. As a society, I imagine that we are not only concerned with getting it right, but we're also concerned with the appearance of getting it right.
For sure.
That's extremely important.
Yeah.
So and that goes to the faith that the community has in the justice system. So if there is a big press case that this particular officer testified falsely and this person got convicted, based upon that, then you have 15 or 20 other people sitting in jail saying that, hey, that's the same guy that testified falsely in my case. And then you got the community of those 15 people saying that's the guy that testified falsely in my family member's case, my friend's case. You can imagine that the appearance now related to the office and the appearance of justice, whether or not they're guilty or not, the appearance now is quite awful because you have the appearance to at least the persons who he's affected saying that, well, how do we know that he didn't testify falsely in our cases as well?
100%. But as to
I just want to be clear on what you're saying about numbers aside. It could be 100 cases. In my mind, it shouldn't matter how many cases it is.
I agree, but it depends on the degree of the involvement. So let's say, I mean, you know as well as I do, that if an officer testifies to chain of custody in a case, and Ms. Green's question was, would I categorically commit to dismissing them without reviewing them? And what I'm saying is I don't think that it would be responsible for me to make that commitment because we know the variability of the kinds of testimony we're talking about. And so if an officer were to be found to have committed a violation and many years prior testified to chain of custody or to a voucher number, then I would certainly look at every case that officer testified, but I would evaluate based on the number of cases, the extent of the testimony, the rest of the evidence, and the integrity of the office. And of course, as you say, Mr. Donaldson, the appearance of integrity of the office is of the utmost importance and is something I'm completely committed to as district attorney. But
that's fair. That's fair. I want to give everyone some time for questions. Mr. Smiley, go right ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Calvin Smiley. I'm an assistant professor at Hunter College in the sociology department and associate faculty in the Roosevelt House for Public Policy. So I appreciate you being here tonight, and I have a couple of questions, and so they'll be coming from more of a social science perspective rather than a legal perspective, but hopefully you can just share your thoughts and opinions on these. So the first question, since the death of George Floyd and other high-profile deaths of Black and brown residents across the United States, there's been a growing abolitionist movement on the rise that seeks out true transformative change, and that really has started with the hashtag defund the police. So could you tell us your interpretation of what the defund movement is, as well as if you were elected, how would you plan to incorporate, if at all, any of the demands surrounding this growing movement?
Sorry, I muted myself because there's chaos at the door. I don't know that it is sort of for me to define defund the police. Like many people, I understand it to be a spectrum, but I think that the way you started it is really right, that it is at its core and rightly an abolitionist effort and imagining an abolitionist future. I see the progressive prosecution movement, of which I am very much a part, having run a national criminal justice reform organization and worked alongside some of the most progressive prosecutors in the country in implementing the kinds of reforms Manhattanites are calling for. I see it as being one portion of this longer term project towards an abolitionist future. And defund the police is a parallel and probably further along part of that project. So what I'm committed to as district attorney is doing all that I can to shrink the carceral footprint in Manhattan. And that includes declining to prosecute cases that don't belong in the system, diverting cases into other systems that are better served by Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, public hospital system, and others. And of course, ending the reliance on the draconian policies that have resulted in the unduly long sentences that have really contributed to mass incarceration in our state and nationwide. And at the same time, and I think that there's a beautiful book about abolition by Josh Dubler, the religion professor at Rochester, Break Every Yoke, where he talks about an abolitionist future. And I think that I shouldn't say reasonable minds, but people disagree about the best way to get there. And I identified the extent to which prosecutors have been tremendously a part of the problem that has gotten us to where we are. And not everyone agrees that prosecutors or someone who has served as a prosecutor can be part of dismantling. But when I look at the district attorneys nationally who are doing the work, at Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn, at Kim Fox in Chicago, they are people who have deep roots in the prosecutor's offices, where they are now implementing the kind of reforms that in this generation, I believe, are going to get us closer to defunding the police and towards an abolitionist future.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the audience I want to jump in with. I'm going to read it because it's a good question. How do you intend to balance criminal prosecutions with reimagining mental health system partnerships post-COVID-19 while also achieving justice for the victim? And I think we're asking that question because there's a significant community health mental challenges right now, and we think they're going to, statistics say they're going to increase exponentially after this COVID calms down a little bit. So how do you plan on driving the two while at the same time paying attention to the needs of the victim?
There are so many pieces embedded in that question. One of which is this piece around, you got a smart audience out there. One of which is this piece about whether prosecutors speak for the victim rather. And in my experience, both as a prosecutor, serving as an assistant DA and in working in criminal justice reform, far too often prosecutors deign to speak for the victim without really understanding, especially in a culturally humble and trauma-informed way, what it is victims really want. And of course, sometimes people who are crime survivors are not, their feelings about what an appropriate resolution evolves over time. So one piece of it is that prosecutors have to bear in mind that in addition to assessing the needs and desires of a victim or a survivor, that the prosecutor really represents the whole of the community first. And so even when a victim is calling for blood, as in my experience, sometimes they do, that is not going to get us closer to a decarceral future. And that has to be part of the district attorney's job in seeking community wellness. So one is to say not to hide behind sort of the shield of the victim. And then do you mind just reading me the first portion of the question again?
Sure. It says, how do you intend to balance criminal prosecutions with reimagining mental health?
Mental health, yeah. Got it. And then the mental health piece is so vitally important. There's no question that mental health challenges are increasing. And as a person who has people close to me who have suffered from serious mental illness, I am very attuned to how easy it is for someone to decompensate and how much attention, support, home environment, having your basic needs met can really enable someone to lead a successful life, even when they do go through periods of mental health challenge. So I've set forth on my website a pretty comprehensive plan built alongside community advocates, including clinicians and mental health experts and directly impacted community members, that lays out a plan for really wherever possible, diverting cases into public health systems and into clinical treatment rather than into the criminal justice system. Because, I was probably a few years into my practice at the district attorney's office when a defense attorney said to me, my client suffers from from schizophrenia, and then sort of said, well, almost all my clients do. And I was really floored by it, because I kind of took a step back and looked at the number of cases I handled. And of course, that was an overstatement and not an actual diagnosis. But the truth is that so many people who came through the criminal justice system, even well before COVID, suffered from mental health challenges. And we are only going to be in a worse position coming out of this with 1 million New Yorkers out of work. So the mental health issues of people who touch the criminal justice system, both people who are charged with crimes and people who are victimized, has to be a major priority for the DA. So one area that I'm going to invest deeply in is in ensuring that there are clinical staff available in the DA's office so that victims can receive the trauma-informed care that they need, regardless of what the outcome of the case is. And that wherever possible, we're not keeping those matters in the DA's office or keeping control over them or exercising the criminal punishment bureaucracy over people, but really outsourcing to and supporting community-based organizations who may be better suited to address the multitude of mental health issues we're going to see emerging as we come out of the pandemic.
Okay, fantastic. Mr. Aliaga, do you have a question for Lucy?
Yep. Thanks, Xavier.
You're welcome.
Hi, Attorney Lucy. I'm taking a look at your website, and I appreciate the focus on sex crimes. I used to be a prosecutor. Now I work about 50% of my practice is on Child Victim Act cases representing individuals against institutions and adult perpetrators of some of the more heinous parts of human nature. It's problematic in a lot of ways because the civil system doesn't give civil plaintiff attorneys the same tools that prosecutors do. So a lot of the weight is on these offices to think about this in a trauma-informed way, which is on your website, which is something you don't see on DA's offices. So that's great to see. On the that's the nice part about this question. The thing I'm curious about is if we're looking really hard at destigmatizing the contacts that people have had with the criminal justice system in sex crimes work, in the sex trade. Something I haven't seen, and maybe this is a quick glance, so I didn't see it, but are you committed to helping survivors who have had to resort to working in the sex trade, have convictions, have contacts with the system? Now they're trying to change their life. Now they're trying to get public assistance, trying to find jobs. They have to come forward and report that they have these convictions for crimes that we know now were racially and selectively enforced on them. Are you going to help them expunge those convictions? Or are you going to help decriminalize that work in the future? What's your take on that?
And Lucy, before you answer that question, unfortunately, I'm going to give you a minute to answer that question, and I'm holding you to a minute. And then after that, we need you to close, and you have about 120 seconds to do so. So answer that question briefly, then give us one of those fantastic closings.
Great. Then I will direct you on my website to my plan for better supporting LGBTQ+ communities and to addressing human trafficking, both of which lay out that I do not believe in prosecuting private consensual sex between adults, and I believe in looking back and expunging and sealing all records that carry those convictions with them from the past. I also believe in using human trafficking law to ensure that people who are survivors receive the support that they need, and people who exploit others for sexual trafficking purposes are held accountable for it. So I think if you check out those plans, you'll see a little more specifics with respect to how I intend to take a trauma-informed approach that includes looking back and better supporting people who have been victimized by the criminal justice system by dint of us criminalizing what we now know was really exploitation. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I don't know if it answered. It sounded, yes, it did actually. I'm sorry, Mr. Elliott. It actually did. So you have 2 minutes left, but I will take your time to do your closing. And if you finish early, I might ask you another question, but please feel free to give us a closing.
Thank you. I'm thinking hard on Ms. Green's question, and I want to continue thinking on it and hope we can continue the conversation on it. And I didn't mean to sort of punt it to say, I don't know what the numbers are, but the truth is I really would, it's a problem I would like to look deeply at and think requires more than I can answer in a cursory response. And part of it is because it implicates core issues of justice, and it implicates the way the public perceives the office. And part of it is that there's a real procedural question about how to actually identify and accomplish all of that. So I hope that we can keep the conversation going around that. You know, when I responded to a scene many years ago in which a terrible violent crime, two masked gunmen stepped out from behind parked cars on Upper Broadway and opened fire, hitting 5 people and killing one who was the father of a 3-year-old. I became close to the mother of the young man who'd been killed over the course of the investigation. Ultimately, we were able to build a circumstantial case against the 2 people who committed the murder. They went to trial. I tried it over the course of 6 weeks and 50 witnesses, and jury returned a verdict of guilty. And when I called the mother of the young man who'd been killed the day after the guilty verdict and asked her how she felt, and this goes to the question from the audience in part about how victims feel, she said to me, "I slept all night for the first time since Shadell was killed. But when I woke up, all I could think about were the moms of those 2 boys." And she was referring to the 2 men who had just been convicted of murdering her son. That incredible compassion was part of what inspired me to create a first of its kind college and prison course that brings assistant DAs inside New York State's prisons. I've taught that course in 3 state prisons. I've put 80 Manhattan assistant DAs through the class. It's expanded to the Brooklyn DA's office and other district attorneys' offices nationwide. And I would make it a mandatory part of legal training at the district attorney's office, because the shortest way, in my view, to do the work of decarceration is to expose the people who are part of fueling it to how dehumanizing it is. And that's why I have been a leading voice for ending the practice of felony disenfranchisement. We know that stripping people of their right to vote detaches people from community ties, and that it goes back to Jim Crow era, that all the states passed those laws in an intentional effort to disenfranchise newly enfranchised Black Americans. And I can imagine a very different system in which myself and my fellow candidates had to go advocate for our positions with our constituents behind bars. And that would get us a lot closer to a future of the kind that you've been raising, which is more what we want to see. And I believe we can solve mass incarceration in our generation. I believe that we can do the work of reckoning with racial injustice in this country. I've worked to reform the system from inside as an assistant DA and from outside alongside leading progressive prosecutors. I'm honored to have the support of families who've lost loved ones to police violence, and we didn't have adequate time to explore police accountability, but I hope we will check out the plan that I built alongside Sean Bell's mother and other incredible advocates who've endorsed me, which is set forth on my website. And my plans for addressing the sex crimes unit built alongside survivors of Harvey Weinstein and other survivors of sexual violence who have supported my candidacy. And I hope that I can impress upon you that my commitment to the district attorney's office is to work alongside communities most directly impacted and the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, including members of the defense bar, the affinity bars, and others, to build a Manhattan that treats everyone with the dignity we all deserve, that has for far too long been absolutely absent our criminal justice system.
Thank you very much for your time, Ms. Lang. Good luck in the rest of your campaign. We appreciate you coming in and talk to us. Thank you.
Anytime. Take good care, everyone. Okay,
bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so guys, thank you very much. I think we're doing well on time. It's been very informative so far. We're going to keep this thing rolling. Diana Florence is next. I think she's already here waiting for us to get started. Ms. Florence, what we're going to do is we're going to start the questioning off. I believe we're going to start with Mr. Costa, if you're ready. Mr. Costa, are you there?
I am. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you. How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Okay, so we want to get the question started with Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa. Ms. Florence, thank you very much for joining us. Ms. Costa, please ask your first question.
Oh, Ms. Acosta is my campaign manager.
Oh, why is she there?
I think she thought she could come on. If that's not okay.
Well, those were the instructions, but I'm happy to sign off.
Well, Ms. Acosta, feel free to ask me a question.
Oh my gosh, you got to get me creative. I see a familiar face in this.
Okay, well, you hold on. We'll talk to you in a second. See, you got me looking crazy on national TV.
I'm sorry about that.
Professor Huck, we're going to start with you again. Please ask Ms. Florence the first question. Ms. Acosta, you and I are going to have a talk later on.
Are we not doing an opening statement? We're just going right to questions?
We're going right to questioning. You are prepared to get right to those questions. We're getting started.
Great.
Professor.
All right. So welcome. I'm Shumtoli Haq. I'm a professor at CUNY School of Law. It's the only law school that has explicit social justice mission. And my questions relate to a lot of the expertise that my colleagues have on immigration. The questions are yes, no, so just no elaborations on that.
Okay.
So as a prosecutor, you know that your decisions have implications for non-citizen immigrant defendants. In Padilla versus Kentucky, Supreme Court has held that criminal defense attorneys have an obligation to their clients. So the first question, there's 4 quick rapid fire questions after that. Do you agree that prosecutors have a legal and ethical obligation to mitigate and avoid immigration consequences based on your criminal prosecution? That's the first.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So related to that, to minimize the harm to immigrant defendants, would you agree to decline and not commit not to prosecute low-level nonviolent offenses, like for example, type A misdemeanors, larceny, criminal possession of a forged instrument, or trademark counterfeiting? A lot of issues that are actually crimes that immigrant defendants are charged with. Would you commit to decline to prosecute? Yes or no?
Decline
and commit not to prosecute low-level nonviolent offenses and misdemeanors.
I can't answer that across the board, but I do want to minimize immigration so we could find other solutions.
Okay, so specific crimes, petty larceny.
Petty larceny, but in favor of something else. I can't just say I'm going to.
Okay, so you're not in favor of a categorical declination. Great. Second, would you adopt a plea policy requiring consideration of your attorneys to avoid immigration consequences from prosecution?
Absolutely.
Do you have a policy right now written?
Yes, I mean, I have an immigration policy on my website.
No,
yes.
do you have a policy regarding plea bargaining that avoids immigration consequences? Do you have that presently written?
I have policies about plea bargaining and in taking into consideration. I don't know.
No, my question is very direct. It's like, do you have a written plea policy that discusses the immigration consequences from the plea? You might have a general plea policy. I'm talking about immigration.
Yes, I understand. I talk about that exact issue in my immigration policy. So yes.
Okay. If you can drop it, your staff member can drop the link to that specific policy. The last question, 2 questions I have is, would you create a board that would use post-conviction remedies to review any prior criminal convictions that have immigration consequences? For example, using any of the tools at your disposal. One of my colleagues suggested an immigration integrity unit similar to a conviction integrity unit.
I mean, I see it as part of the conviction integrity unit. So yes.
Okay, great. And then the last related to the sort of community oversight is, as a prosecutor, you're one of the actors in the criminal legal system that has minimal oversight to none, I would say. Towards that end, to have greater community oversight over your decisions, your office's decision, would you be open to community oversight, including an annual audit on your decisions, independent experts reviewing your decisions, particularly for bringing charges forward, and also that would recommend decisions for repair, for restorative justice, or any other form of community input at the point of deciding whether to prosecute?
I'm glad you asked that. I have an exact policy on this. It's called the Village Model of Prosecution, and you can look at it. It's about the new approach to pleas.
Right. So maybe you can also do you want to share just a little bit about what your village model is?
Sure, absolutely. So, I understand being a career prosecutor, I understand that sort of the default is that the prosecutor gets to decide everything, right? And that's not worked out so well especially for marginalized communities.
Right.
So my approach, the Village, which apologies because I'm always bad with remembering what it's actually an acronym, but it's a various interests which involving engagement. I'm sorry, I've muddled the acronym, but what it really means is the idea is we want to get together a team. We don't want the prosecutor to be the sole decider of how cases are disposed of. And the way we're going to sort of roll this out is really concentrating on cases with people that are below 30. So more youth oriented, but doesn't have to be. We can opt into it. And the idea would be when a case comes in, we want to do a workup. So we want a social worker, and obviously this has to be, of course, with the consent of the defense attorney and the accused. But we want to do a workup both on the person, what brought them into the criminal justice system, not just the facts of the case, but actually their circumstances that got them there. Let's say a shoplift, just to make it simple, a theft of a soda. That's a very open and shut case, but you got to ask the whys. So we're going to do a workup. We're going to do an investigative. Why did he need that? Does he have a drug problem? Does he have mental health issues? Then what we're going to do is take that information and we're going to put that into a report. We're going to share that with the defense attorney, and then we are going to come up with a solution together, taking into consideration all of that. The tail end of it, which kind of dovetails onto your question, is going to have just that sort of a community-based advisory that's going to audit us every year. We're going to be putting all this on our website in a data dashboard, but we're going to take a look and see, did we ultimately do what we wanted to do, which is not overly rely on incarceration, and even when we do have to use incarceration, did we ultimately get this person off the criminal track? Have we actually come up with a sentencing plan that beyond incarceration is going to get them a job, stable housing, treatment? That's going to be all part of it. So that's a little bit of a kind of sort of overview. I'm happy for you to take a look, and I'll also would love feedback, because I will say, because I didn't get to open, I have immense respect for the CUNY School of Law. You guys are the #1 public interest law school in the country, and one of my policies is about doing a CUNY covenant. I think we need to be making sure that there are DAs that are hired every year from CUNY Law School, and I think that's part of the CUNY covenant. So.
Great. Well, maybe we can change your mind on the immigration policies, but we're here.
I don't think you need to. I think it's just that I didn't get to talk about it. So could I talk for 1 minute? Because I think
I think I want my colleagues to have an opportunity. I'm happy to talk offline, but you've said you're unwilling to do a categorical declination, which other candidates have, and you don't have a written policy. So I think you answered it, and let's move on in the interest. And I'm happy to talk to you offline.
I guess let me just
say wait, Diana, wait. What we're going to do is we'll circle back to that. Mr. Coffey, do you have any questions for Diana?
Hi, Ms. Florence. My name is Professor Terence Coffey. I teach forensic justice and problem solving course at New York University. I appreciate the idea of taking a holistic approach at the client who's coming in, because it's one thing when we look at the behavior as well as the causation of criminality that takes place, particularly in Black and Brown communities. And with that said, in a lot of my questions, let me say to you, I'm from the advocacy and community-based perspective. So you're going to have a lot of the logistical questions that can, pertinent to that, but I kind of try to reflect the voices of those students I teach, as well as the communities I represent, along with those individuals who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And what was brought for me to ask, you spent over, I think, 25 years within the district attorney's office, and for a lot of those individuals that I work with, the idea of spending that much time in the district attorney's, the DA's office here in Manhattan, at the height of stop and frisk, at the height of the disproportionate arrest of Black and Brown men for the usage of marijuana, and we can go down the list. In your role as district attorney, we know you've probably established relationships. How do you, with that background that's so closely related to that, seek to rebrand who you are as opposed to your role in the last 25 years? Because there may be a concern that there may be a continuation of those self-same policies and those relationships that you've dealt with or established in the district attorney's office over 25 years and coming to this space.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and it's a fair one. I'm going to tell you, though, I don't have to rebrand myself, because the way I've comported myself over 25 years is I've actually done criminal justice reform from within. And that's because I've used the power of the prosecutor to advantage regular people. And that started when I was doing domestic violence. I didn't immediately just default to either forcing the woman to testify or dismissing the case, right? I met people where they were. My village policy that I just mentioned, that's not something I hired someone to do. That comes out of my work and my heart. I understand that everyone, including lawyers, right? We come to this Zoom tonight with our own sort of mixture of experiences, our moods, our feelings, and we do things at a certain time. So the point is, what we need to be doing is really using that humanity to inform our work. And so I did that in domestic violence, making sure that, kids and families, if that's what they needed, a criminal case, I worked with them to get them ready. If they didn't want to testify and we wanted accountability, we found other ways, maybe document crimes, or maybe I'll help them find counseling for the family. That was what I did early on. But the latter part of my career, 20 years, was really prosecuting white collar and corruption. And why I mentioned that that's relevant here is that I looked at those cases also very much through the lens of, what brought people to these moments. So when I prosecuted companies that were falsifying the safety test on the World Trade Center, that case started, and I think it's a good story for this group. It started with an individual who was formerly incarcerated. He'd been gang involved, and he was a member of the Teamsters Union. He had found his way out of criminality, and he was accused of faking a concrete test at the Yankee Stadium. And this big, powerful company tried to blame him for it and say, oh, it was just him. And the case was presented to me as something that, I should just sort of rubber stamp. But the thing is, I'm a New Yorker, right? And I knew that this guy every day was coming from Brownsville carrying heavy equipment. And he was going through Brownsville, Manhattan, and then the Bronx. And it didn't make sense to me that he would fake a test and carry the heavy equipment. Because I know me, if I were going to fake a test, I would leave the heavy stuff at home. I wouldn't take it up the stairways. And just being a little cynical of what was brought before me ultimately led me and my team to uncover a massive fraud that wasn't just at this company. It went to the top of this company, but it was a massive software program that was falsifying test after test, not just at Yankee Stadium, but at major landmarks. And so the point is, what we need to be doing is actually questioning what comes before us and looking at the individuals that come before us as well. And it's that approach that I've taken throughout my career that will inform me as district attorney. I understand that the office for too long has operated as a justice factory, and that it is still organized as if it's 1975, tied to a court system that doesn't even exist. My approach is about attacking crimes of power, not crimes of poverty. And that means wage theft and health and safety. I have a deep record in doing those types of cases. I brought wage theft to the district attorney's office that had never been done other than prevailing wage. I have done these cases, and I understand that the DA's office, instead of marginalizing and keeping Black and Brown communities in their place, we can empower them to come and have access, just like the rich and powerful have, and ultimately turn the district attorney's office into a real place of community. I don't say this as rhetoric. It's what I did as the chief of the construction fraud task force. And I will at some point circle back, because I don't want to be, because my immigration policy is solid, and I'd love to talk about it some more, but I won't co-opt your question, Professor Kopp.
All right. And just for my other colleagues to be able to engage in this conversation with you, I do have one last question.
Sure.
Historically,
Coffey, before you ask that question, Ms. Florence, I'm going to need you to keep the answer to whatever question it is to 1 minute.
Sure.
Historically, the district attorney's office has been seen as an extension of law enforcement in Black and Brown communities. How do you seek to gain the trust of Black and brown constituents who are going to hear this tonight, who are going to look to you to say, can you bring us equality and equity within the realm of our justice system here in New York City?
1 minute.
It's going to be just like I did before. I didn't sit in my office and wait for cases and passively take them and process them. We need to leave our office. That means DAs in the library. That means DAs at the community boards. That means us being a part of the community, not occasionally when we feel like it. And I know from doing that work, that's how I got the major wage theft cases and the health and safety and get the frauds before they started. Because when you keep showing up, they see your face, people start to trust you, and they understand that your goal is not to wield the power, but actually to use the power to make sure things are actually just and fair.
And I think just one last question, Mr. Donaldson. Are you committed to creating a community integrity board that's similar to what they have, but with members from the communities? Because one of the things Miss Donaldson, not you, Mr. Donaldson, this Miss Donaldson, she stated that a lot of times these committees and boards are created within these organizations, but they're not reflective of the people from the community. Yeah. They are there in name, and they're entitled and all that stuff, but it's never people directly from the communities that are in those offices, that are on those boards, that are connected to the community.
And I'll just very quickly say, in the task force, I had a group of community-based organizations that came in, and it wasn't about having a show, an advisory board where we just eat bagels and I talk and then we don't see you for a year. It's about actually being actually accountable. So yes, it's going to involve the community, but it's also going to hear them. And then 3 months later, we're going to talk about what happened last time and how we addressed it.
Okay, that was very good and short. Thank you. Mr. Ross, do you have any questions for Ms. Florence? A brief one.
Sure.
Ms. Florence, brief answer.
Sure. So in response to the spike in anti-Asian violence across the city, where would you stand on pursuing hate crimes charges? Do you find them to be effective at all? And given that there is a lot of community trauma, how would you address the community, and what would those solutions from a DA's point of view be for actual safety? And how would you convey that to a community that is still very raw, and both in terms of how do you seek a redress for the individual victims, but also how do you look at community safety, and not just within the API community, but all communities that do experience a level of violence?
Yeah, so just talking about hate crimes, the real problem with the hate crime prosecution right now is that the DA, frankly, he hesitates, and we need to call hate out when we see it. And so for me, yes, it's about charging the hate crimes when they happen, but it's also, of course, thinking not just so reactively, but also proactively. In the late 30s, the Nazi Party of Germany had an American angle, and here an extension rather, and they were actually prosecuted for their financial frauds and its founder by the Manhattan DA's office. We can do that with the Proud Boys. We can do that with other white supremacist groups. We cannot simply just wait for the attacks to happen. We need to be attacking organized hate. But then we also need to be looking, again, we have to look at the person who committed the hate as well as the victim. We need to be out there making sure victims know that they're protected, but we also need to be figuring out what happened. Of course, restorative justice is important, but I always say that you need to make sure that restorative justice takes into consideration the survivors. It cannot be thrust upon them, but ultimately the goal is to mitigate hate. So to me, it has to be reactive and proactive.
Mr. Aliaga, quick question. Ms. Florence, brief answer. Go.
The notion is right now that some of the ways that police misconduct perpetuated itself throughout the system entirely was because prosecutors were either willfully blind or just naive to trust officers and their word. And there's a sentiment that, well, what if we had prosecutors who'd been on the wrong end of the courts, the wrong end of police encounters? You as a district attorney, you're going to control the hiring in your office. if you have 3Ls applying to your job to be line ADAs, but they present themselves with criminal convictions, having made indiscretions before law school, during law school, et cetera, will you at least consider them to enforce law and order? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Of course. No, I think it's really important to have people with a variety of experiences. It's diversity of thought, right? So we want people who come to things from different perspectives. Absolutely. I mean, police accountability, the reason that police accountability is top of mind right now is because it hasn't happened, but you need a real program for it. And my plan, which of course is on my website, is informed by the work that I did, right? I know that now that 50A is declassified, we can use that, and we can, instead of the top 10 landlords, we can go after the top 10 worst police officers. They're there, they're in the database, and doing those cases and having worked with police for many years, this will make their jobs easier too, because once there's a feeling that no one is above the law, that's going to make the ability for police officers to do their job, solving the shooting, solving rapes, solving domestic violence cases. It's going to make it a lot easier.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Florence, you have 2 minutes to do a closing. You didn't get a chance to do your opening, but you have a chance to do your closing. And if you want to incorporate the immigration response, feel free. Go right ahead. 2 minutes, you're on the clock.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. You know, just by way of maybe introduction, you learned a little bit about me through my policies. You know, my passion has been for the work and the people of the state of New York. I've done this work for 25 years, and I stayed in a very difficult place. It was a concierge system of justice, but my work was on behalf of tenants, immigrants, and workers. And why I push back on the immigration policy is I am very committed to making sure immigration policies are, that immigration consequences are thought about. And we need to be making sure that people can be held accountable in different ways. So what that means is that if someone commits a crime and the same crime is committed by an immigrant and a non-immigrant, they both can be held accountable, but they may not always face the same charges. So in the case of a petit larceny, maybe we wouldn't charge as a petit larceny. Maybe we'd find a different crime to charge them with where they can still be held accountable, or maybe we wouldn't charge it at all. The point is, we cannot come up with blanket policies. We need to be looking in each case. But if your goal is to mitigate immigration consequences, which has always been my goal, because you look at my work, I've prosecuted on behalf of undocumented immigrants. I have set the policy about making sure that no defense counsel gets to ask about immigration status, because immigration status is not a crime. That is where I come from, these issues. So look, my campaign is built on the idea of crimes of power, not crimes of poverty. It's supported by almost 18 labor unions, 17 today, and almost 18 because I have one that I'm not allowed to announce just yet. But I'm going to tell you that's because of the work that I've done. They understand that I have never shrunk against the powerful in this city. I have taken them on. I've been innovative. And that's what I will do as your district attorney. I know that I will be elected to represent all people, and that's how I will use the power to put people before power. You're muted, Mr. Donaldson.
I'm sorry, my sons, they keep doing it by accident. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate your time, and with no further questions, thank you very much, Ms. Florence.
Thank you very much.
All right, next up, hey, how are you? She's already in the waiting room, or already here. Hi, how are you?
I'm well, how are you doing? It's great to be here with everyone.
It's good to see you. It's good to see you. Okay, so we've been doing this where we start right out, we get right into the questions. We don't give the candidate time for an opening statement. We want to spend our time with the questions. Great. So I'm going to go first this time. I'm skipping. I know everybody's mad at me, but I'm skipping. So I'm taking the advantage of my position right now. So I got a quick question for you. What exactly do you do with the prosecutors who commit Brady violations or who, I guess, break the law or not do things that cause people to get convicted that they shouldn't have done? What do you do with those prosecutors if you're the DA?
Terminate them, and if it's a pattern in practice, then request suspension of their license.
Okay, that was a very quick and to the point answer. All right.
I can elaborate.
No, we
I'm
like
trying to
quick,
respect.
we
Okay,
like quick and to the point answers.
we don't mince words. These are positions of public trust and these kind of, and look, as a trial lawyer, I've had prosecutors pop up with evidence in the middle of my trial, manipulated evidence that was clearly withheld. And so not only have I been on the receiving end of that kind of sabotage, but we all know the kind of damage that something like that does.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Ms. Green, you have the floor.
Hi, my name is Emilia Green. I'm a lawyer at the law firm of Neufeld, Check and Breston. I represent individuals who have had their civil rights violated by police misconduct in civil rights lawsuits. But there are Black and brown people every day who are having interactions with the police and the criminal justice system where their rights are being violated, whether it's in the context of a stop, the context of the type of things that doesn't rise to even the level of criminal prosecution, does not rise to the level of a civil remedy. Nonetheless, people are having their rights violated by the police every day. What would you do as Manhattan DA to hold police officers accountable for what one might describe as garden variety misconduct that has no other remedy?
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Ms. Green. That's part of my focus as a civil rights attorney are excessive force cases, false arrests, false imprisonments, malicious prosecution, things of that sort. And you're right, there's garden variety misconduct to the point that sometimes the court chalks it up to just de minimis force or benign things that really aren't worth an entire litigation. But one of the things that I focus on in my police accountability policy and my declination policy is scrapping the early case assessment bureau and establishing instead an arrest review unit to restructure how we're thinking about charges or complaints brought by officers. We know that a lot of arrest reports are not properly filled out, are intentionally not properly filled out. And this is somebody that is introducing this to the justice system. And so what I propose is not just having a list where we say, here are officers who lied, but going further and getting as much information about their civil rights cases, their disciplinary records. What is the source of this evidence? What's the history of this officer? How did it come to be that they come in contact with the civilian? And then have all of this data published and made publicly available, and then use it to ensure that these officers are no longer serving on the force. And I think to have an office like the district attorney's office to take that position is very powerful, and to be proactive in that, to say, we're not going to wait until we find out that this officer has lied on hundreds of cases from Manhattan to Queens to the Office of the Special Narcotics Prosecutor and just apologize and vacate them, but to say we're identifying these policies, these patterns and practices early on through this arrest review unit. And we can make that data available to prevent these things from happening.
And what would be your response to those who say it's not the job of the DA to be setting policy with respect to disciplining and holding police accountable?
Oh, I think it absolutely is, because if we could keep covering up for bad policing, that perpetuates not only the wrongful convictions, but coercion and automation of the criminal justice system. I think a lot of cases end in a plea. A lot of cases rely on single testimony from officers, corroborated affidavits and things of that sort. We have to look into it. It's a no-brainer. And I think that because, again, officers, just like prosecutors, serve in positions of public trust, we don't work for them. We work with them. And it's our obligation to ensure there's integrity in the process.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Smiley.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Calvin Smiley, and I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department at Hunter College. So my first question will be, since the death of George Floyd and other high-profile deaths of Black and brown residents across the United States, there's been a growing abolitionist movement that really is seeking out transformative change, starting with the hashtag defund the police. So could you tell us your interpretation of the defund movement, as well as, if you were elected, how would you plan to incorporate, if at all, any of the demands surrounding this growing social movement?
Yeah, I think it's a demand that's been, whose drums have been beating for a long time and long overdue. I think we have to get society away from the addiction of policing everything and throwing police at everything, and having our communities, particularly Black and Latino communities, surveilled, patrolled, still stop and frisked, and targeted by this system, particularly our youth. Things like the gang database and the DNA database that all serve as just mass supervision and pre-criminalization of communities of color. It also serves to envision a world where we don't need police, right? Where there is sufficient resources for communities, because when you look at some of the safest neighborhoods in Manhattan or across the city, you're not going to see the heavy police presence. You're not going to see floodlights blasting into people's apartments. You're not going to hear the no-knock warrants going off at 3, 4 in the morning. You're going to see resources. You're going to see good schools, high employment rates, mental health programs, after-school programs. You're going to see as much resources as possible to support families instead of criminalizing the struggles and the instabilities. And for me, having come from that background where my father was sentenced to 22 years and my mom was a single parent of 10 kids, we could have been that statistic of kids that ended up in the streets. And the prosecutors wouldn't care, and neither would the system. And we would be free game for officers to prey on. And so it's important that the district attorney is mindful of that. It's important that we use this office as a bully pulpit to further those reforms, to have this office saying things out loud. I mean, it's not a complete victory, but I think it was pretty bold of our Attorney General Tish James to not only have a historic hearing about officers beating protesters, but to then take it to the next level and file a lawsuit wherein she declared that there were abusive policies and practices intentionally against protesters. And yeah, they want to appoint a court monitor. It might stall the process. It very well might not go anywhere, like the handshoe case. But that declaration, I think, is a victory. And it's one that Commissioner Shea and the mayor couldn't argue with, because while he kept saying, like, I didn't see it, I don't know. She was like, no, I heard it. I saw it. We should do something about it. And so to have the district attorney step into that arena and take the leadership and take the talking points away from the police union and say, no, we are here too, and we can tell you what's going on and what needs to change.
Great,
Okay.
Thank you. And if I could ask one more real quick question.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I appreciate you speaking about your own family history here. So with that being said, with a growing number of elderly incarcerated individuals in state prison, how likely are you to, in your position, review cases of elderly or infirm persons who've been incarcerated, particularly for long periods of time, and give real consideration to promoting their release?
Yeah, I'm very committed. I have a policy on my website to establish a sentencing review unit that focuses on reducing sentences of more than 20 years, eliminating or working with the defense to vacate sentences for charges that under my administration I would never have charged, and to review sentencing for people who are immunocompromised. So all of the reforms or all of the efficiency that we practiced during the pandemic but to continue that reduction and nuance to these cases.
Okay, all right. Mr. Aliaga, question.
Yes, hi, candidate Ibushi. You sort of touched on this before about the police unions, and look at it from the way nuts and bolts it works for the DAs who have to comply with things like discovery obligations or having to work with non-cooperative police officers to enhance a case post-arrest. Can't generalize, but there's a healthy amount of NYPD officers, especially now, who once they make the arrest, job's done. They don't need to get extra surveillance video that may exonerate or may provide the picture. They don't need to get extra paperwork. The discovery obligations that a Manhattan ADA has to complete, they're kind of caught between having to have a working relationship with the cops and try to form some kind of friendship, but at the same time, keep it professional. This is in the context of, like you mentioned, union leadership is openly pro-Trump, and that trickles down and kind of affects the whole relationship. So from your perspective, how do you approach the relationship between the DA's office and the NYPD, knowing that if you, well, I don't want to speak for you, but like I mentioned, it could complicate discovery issues. It could complicate investigatory avenues.
I think it's important for the district attorney to establish its independence from the NYPD and to reestablish itself as one that is focused on justice, transparency, and accountability. And my work in 1983 claims and holding officers accountable, yes, there was resistance, but at the end of the day, whether I'm suing the police commissioner, by the end of that case, I'm sitting across the table and we're rewriting policy. And I think that's the independence that we must bring to the DA's office. Again, we don't work for the NYPD. We might have to work with them, but we can't cover up for bad policing, even though sometimes that helps cover up for bad prosecutions, malicious prosecutions. And so we have to separate them. And that is why the data collection at the arrest review unit is so important. It's not going to be an opinion. It's going to be conclusions supported by data that is made publicly available, that is done by a third-party agency, someone like maybe the Vera Institute, to come in there and really analyze that. And then again, use this office to push for the necessary reforms. And will there be resistance? Sure. I'm expecting to be on the union's Twitter or the SBA's Twitter at some point before election or even after if we win. Absolutely. But for me, my focus and my priority is not what are they going to say and how much are they going to resist. It's how many more families can we prevent from falling into these abuses, from being targeted, right? From waiting until the back end, decades in litigation or decades after serving long-term sentences and saying, here's this very basic thing we had in our possession that we somehow forgot to turn over. And only decades later in some roundabout FOIA request did this exculpatory evidence come to light. And lo and behold, a cop lied about something. These are things we can figure out in the front end. And I think there's no way around it. This is not something we should shy away from, even if we rock the boat.
1 second. I have a question from the audience that I'd like to get answered, if you don't mind. The question is, and I'll read it. What are your policies, if any, on artificial intelligence, Clearview facial recognition used by the NYPD, specifically with regards to racial bias and classification tools?
Yeah, I think those are the very types of policies and systems that are inherently racist, that serve to continue to target communities of color. That is the automation of justice, right? We don't have to do the work of investigation. We don't have to look for exculpatory evidence. Here we have a system that consistently misidentifies people of color, that is going to bring up any kind of picture and say that person, which is kind of how it's done now on the human side. And instead we've automated it. So I think we need to do away with those systems. We need to highly criticize them and make sure that we don't cut corners on what it means to investigate and have open file discovery and make this information available and just do the real work.
Very good. Thank you very much. Professor Huck.
Great. Good to see you. So my name is Shantoliak. I'm a professor at CUNY Law School. And my question is, how would you respond to some of your maybe critiques that you don't have experience in terms of managing a large office, a large budget? So how would you respond to that, that specific critique of your qualification?
Yeah, I think two things. One, this is not a one-woman show. This is an office where you're going to rely on your executive ADAs and your staff to further your vision of justice. Every district attorney that came in that office, with the exception of Morgenthau, because he was there for almost half a century, didn't manage that kind of office, didn't have that kind of experience, but was able to hold down the fort because they had a very strong transition team. So we are currently working with the defense bar to identify bureau chiefs that will be problematic in furthering our vision of justice and identifying a very strong transition team that's going to help us hold the fort while we shake things up. Secondly, as you know, the district attorney is not going to be trying cases. I mean, we can try cases all day long, but the district attorney is going to be establishing policy. And the district attorney for Manhattan is going to be expected to make structural and systemic changes. We're not here to be complacent. We're not here to tweak. We're here to overhaul. And I'm the only candidate in this race that has done that with the NYPD, with the fire department, with taking on issues that with agencies that don't want to change, with agencies that don't want us to cede the power, that want things to stay the same. So it's not enough to just manage an office so that everything is quiet and runs smooth and it looks okay. You have to be willing to roll your sleeves up and get in that gutter and start tearing things up and do it with the public and do it with a strong transition team. And we've seen, whether it's prosecutors like Chesa Boudin or Larry Krasner or D.A. Rollins or Mosby, I mean, even Gascon, they're all changing this. Gascon was a career prosecutor as well. He got in there and had to face the same issues that someone who has never run a prosecutor's office of that size. And it's because it's not knowing who's your employee and where their office is. Is this person going to further that vision of justice? Is this person going to push with me, or is this person going to be an obstacle in that? And to have an advisory council that's ensuring not only are we being held accountable, but that we have those logistics planned out to further that vision of justice.
Great. So just to follow up, another question, if I may. This is on the topic of sexual assault and harassment. Andrea Ritchie, who is an author of an excellent book of Is Visible No More, talks about policing and gender, said that after excessive force, sexual harassment and rape by police officers is the #1 instance of police misconduct. Most recently, NYPD officers Martins and Hill was found not guilty for raping an 18-year-old teenager, alleging that the sex was consensual. How would you address instances where the police are perpetrators of sexual assault, domestic violence, or any other form of gender-based violence? So one is police perpetrators, and then generally, what would you do differently with respect to sex crimes and sexual assault?
I would treat police officers like any other civilian, no special treatment there. And even as a civil rights attorney, I have had officers on my cases disciplined, terminated, or prosecuted for their misconduct. So we don't make an exception because they got a badge. Second thing, in terms of gender-based violence, we have to split it up, right? You have things like domestic violence, which right now is not properly addressed in criminal court. You have a fight with your significant other, your partner. If you have the courage to finally make that call for help, the family's separated, it triggers an order of protection. The separation continues for several months until a deal is reached. And then once that order of protection expires, you're back into the same household. And what have we accomplished? We've sent a signal to the person trying to leave that we're not doing anything for you. And we've put them in a worse situation because the person who is engaged in that harm knows that the system's not going to do anything other than some months of separation and maybe a plea at the end. So what I would do different is, first and foremost, ensure that we are listening to our victims. What do they need? I've represented victims of sexual assaults for many years now. And I've had to fight to get information, to understand what is going on. Sometimes my clients didn't want to go forward with the prosecution, but they were relegated to pieces of evidence because the state doesn't represent victims. The prosecutors don't represent victims, they represent the state, and they can proceed without the victim. And so this is an opportunity to talk about restorative justice, to lean on our community-based organizations. Let's talk about family counseling, individual counseling, anger management, family support. If somebody's trying to leave an abusive relationship, what are we doing to ensure they can actually leave? We know that those who do harm have been harmed themselves. What are we doing to address that? Instead of this automation, let's be serious about it. And address it on that front. And I would also go further to say we have to have a victim's advocate and not just the prosecutor, because victims want to know what happens if I say this, what happens if I do this, what happens if I don't want to go forward. And these are petrifying questions. And it's petrifying to be sitting in a prosecutor's office or to be sitting around police and to put your humiliation and hurt aside and say, I have to think like a lawyer right now because I don't even know what's happening. So I think that we have to be in tune and focus on the healing side instead of this knee-jerk reaction of harming more than the harm that was done to teach a lesson.
A quick question. I think we have more time, so let me run this question by you if you don't mind. And it's very, maybe simple, maybe not, but practicing law as you have and many of us have in this city for quite some time, each office has its own individual policies. And I believe in reality, and I'm sure that your office, if you're elected, will have policies as well. Question is, I guess to my mind is, will you have any policies that require mandatory jail time for any particular case?
So we don't have any policy that says if X, then absolutely Y jail time. In our declination policy, we commit to having alternatives to incarceration regardless of the charge. And that's really where the rubber meets the road here for the progressive movement, the left, the decarceration movement, whatever you want to call it, right? We know how to handle the low-level non-violent offenses. But what about what's considered violent offenses, which could be anything from having a box cutter in your pocket to the rapes and homicides, right? And so we have to break that down and have that nuanced approach per case and understand how are we going to help? How do we restore the community? How do we restore the family, restore the victim? How do we ensure there's rehabilitation in the event that someone is incarcerated? What are the measurements of success?
I got that. Before, I don't want to cut you off, but I think I have to. So for the nonviolent crimes, I'm hoping that most people will agree that there should not be a mandatory incarceration for any nonviolent crime. But I guess what I'm talking about is for alleged violent crimes.
Right.
Will there be will you advocate for, will you have a policy in your office that says that for certain violent allegations, the policy is some amount of prison time?
No.
Okay, next question is, what will be, if any, your relationship with the Southern District of New York and their investigations of criminal behavior that occurs in Manhattan?
In what respect? Whether we'll work with them at all or not?
Yes.
I mean, it depends, but we definitely wouldn't do the work for them or allow them to exacerbate cases that are within our jurisdiction. I think it's also important to be conscious of cases that they might try to take out of our hands as well. But that's how I feel about SDNY.
Okay, very good. I think we have a little more time, but I think I have a follow-up question from the audience. And it says, just to follow up, are you getting rid of wholesale tech tools for Face ID to identify rioters or people of various ethnicities? Please clarify.
Yeah, to the extent that we can, we absolutely would. I think, I represent a lot of protesters. I dig into that discovery when it comes our way. We do those requests to get them, and we see how faulty they are and how it allows for policing to be even more dangerous and lazy.
Very good. Mr. Ross, do you have any questions for our candidate?
Sure. So let me ask a more holistic question, if I may. Sure. So the DA's office represents the people. You are on the ballot. I would say most New Yorkers don't know what the DA's office does, particularly more marginalized communities. I used to work at Brooklyn Legal Services Corp. A, and clients would say, literally, I can't understand legal language. There are so many barriers to understanding the most basic aspects of the system. And for marginalized communities, the only interaction with the system is one of fear or prosecution and persecution. So leading an office that is representing the people and is voted upon by the people at large, how would you attempt to make that more community-based? And how would you bring people into the system and involve them without prosecuting them or beyond that system involvement?
And before you answer that question, we have sum up time now. So what I'm going to ask you to do is answer that question And then while you're answering that question, give us your summary, your summation, or your closing argument.
Sure. There's a couple of things we can do. One, I think it's important to establish an advisory board that is very diverse and includes not just former prosecutors, but defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, academics, social workers, formerly incarcerated, people who are justice impacted, whether they're victims, accused, or like, community leaders. And this is not a consultative group that I can say, hey, I checked that box. These are people who are the eyes and ears on the ground that is saying, this is what's working, this is what's not working, this is what we are seeing happening. And that is going to help influence these policies and continue to tweak them to make sure not only we are being held accountable, but we are responding to the needs, both of things we need to change and things we need to actually start working on. The second thing is we have to ensure that we are hiring people that have walked in the shoes of those impacted by this office. And it's not just the color of your skin, although the Manhattan DA's office can very well use some color. It includes people from, again, diverse backgrounds, especially those who are formerly incarcerated, social workers, mental health professionals, immigration attorneys. So when people walk into that office, they know they are not targets, but there's a comprehensive staff ready that have both the lived experience and the professional experience to respond to the needs, not the knee-jerk reaction of the automated system. So that's just a few ways I would bring the community meaningfully into this office so that we can have that teamwork in building that vision of justice out together. To wrap it up, I will say this has been an amazing discussion, and I really appreciate the technical and nuanced questions, because we can talk about the big headlines and what would be great to happen, but it's the how it's going to happen that's probably a little bit more important. Because a lot is riding on this election. You know, some of you might know that we've had 4 DAs in the last 80 years. Every district attorney has been a white man. We have a historic opportunity to make this office a partner in furthering criminal justice reform instead of it being an obstacle. And it's historic for communities of color. This is a powerful office, not just because it's a large budget and a large staff, but it has an insane amount of discretion, unchecked discretion. And so when you talk about change, you're not fighting with the majority, you're talking about a memo. So the person that will be establishing that memo has to be somebody that sees us as human beings, has to make sure we no longer make people of color the face of crime in this city, has to ensure that being rich and powerful is no longer a get out of jail free card. And we're gonna not let people like the Weinsteins and Trumps use this office as a personal law firm. So when we talk about a prosecutor's job, it's to pursue integrity, it's to ensure public stability, that there are resources in our community. The days of locking people up and throwing them away, throwing the key away, is done under my administration. I'm for second chances, I'm for mercy, I'm for justice, I'm for restoration. And that's the voice and the perspective that has been missing from the office forever. And so this is our Halley's Comet. We've never had this seat open. This is a really strong chance for, again, the left, the progressive movement, whatever you want to call it, for real people like us to get this system off our back and get it start working for the families of not just Manhattan, but for the entire city. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you, and we'll see you at the finish line.
Very, very good. Thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate you coming and speaking for us, or speaking before us.
Absolutely. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. We appreciate you. Okay, so everyone, we're doing very well on time. So thank you all for hanging in there with us. I think this is going fantastic. I think we're getting some good information. I think these candidates are answering our questions to their best ability and answering pretty direct, I might add. So, Ms. Crotty, you are next up. And I hope you don't mind me calling you Liz.
No, please do so. I'm Liz Crotty. Thanks for having me. I'm running for Manhattan DA. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys tonight. So
about to get started. So hold on. I don't want you wasting your time talking to us. I want you to waste your time answering questions.
Okay, great.
All right. So who we're going to have first? So let's see. Mr. Smiley. Why don't you lead us off? Ms. Crotty, this is Mr. Smiley. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Smiley. Dr. Smiley, you gotta go ahead and raise your hand and say, sir, call me Dr. Smiley. I earned this doctor. Dr. Smiley, please start us off.
Hi, my name is Dr. Smiley. Calvin's
See, I
fine.
told you, Dr. Smiley.
I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department at Hunter College and a faculty affiliate with the Roosevelt House School for Public Policy, where I teach courses on social justice and race. So I guess my first question for you will be, in April, so last month, a viral video was posted across social media showing NYPD officers using a robotic dog-like machine known as DigiDog, which was eerily similar to the killer robot dog in the television program Black Mirror. And according to reports, this piece of equipment cost nearly $100,000. And recently, it was reported that the NYPD has cut its ties with the manufacturer for fear because of public backlash. So my question to you is, do you support spending on weaponry and technology to enhance NYPD's ability to surveil and monitor city residents? If yes, why? If not, how would you rather see that money reallocated into the community?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think it's twofold. You know, I think that we do need to have, there's a two-pronged answer to this with the police, because the police are invasive. Sometimes people find police invasive, and that they find that what is going on, they don't like to be confronted by the police. It is a fact that we have to understand that not everyone feels safe when they see the police. So the fact that it could be mechanized in some way is not that bad. But I think really at the core of all this is how do you use the information, right? And what is it that is what is the information they're seeking? And what is it that is, what part of the case is that going towards? And how do you use this information, and what is it for? And is it part of an arrest? And I think that that's really something that we have to look at, because information willy-nilly, you know, helps in intelligence-driven prosecution. But looking at it as a prosecutor, I think that we really need to say, what can we prove beyond a reasonable doubt? I know that the gang database is similar information that gets brought up. And I think, you know, when it comes up to surveillance, you know, and I like to make the distinction that I'm born and raised in Stuyvesant Town, and I'm from a neighborhood. And I know what it's like to grow up in a neighborhood. And I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone did different things, and you hung out with everyone in your neighborhood. And I know that there's been past gang cases where neighborhood affiliations were taken as some sort of culpability. So I think we really have to look at how, not only how we're getting the information, but from a prosecutorial standpoint, how are we using that information? And what is the basis for that information, and what is the end goal of what we're trying to do in holding somebody responsible for committing a crime?
Great. And another question I have is just in terms of in your role as a district attorney, do you agree with the use of life without possibility of parole as a sentencing? Issue?
I don't know how many of you these watch, but I'm pretty consistent this way. I like to, as a constituent and as someone who, as a private citizen, as a defense attorney, I think rare is the case where that is appropriate, but I'm not about to say no, because I don't know what all the cases are in front of me and what all the facts are in front of me. But as a general principle, probably not, but I can't say that. You know, we have to look at things too, as, you know, as DAs, you have to stay objective, you know, and objective to facts. And I think that really waiting to hear all the facts before you make decisions on things is the way to go. But as a general principle, I think it's a rare case, but I'm not going to say never.
Sure. And just so I could just follow up the rest of that question was,
sure.
Do you agree or disagree that it's actually just another form of capital punishment?
Well, no, well, you know, I think it just really depends on the case. I was in law school. I worked the Center for Constitutional Rights as a fellow against the death penalty. I've been against the death penalty for quite some time. And I even went to go work at the DA's office when the death penalty was still in place, because I was there from 2000, 2006, and it wasn't abolished until 2007. So again, rare is the case that I think that is appropriate for. And in that rare, in that being a very select case, I think it just depends on the facts, but I am against capital punishment. I see that there is a very little distinction, but I do think that there is a difference between getting to live your life out and being killed by the state, which I think is a fundamentally unjust thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Coffey.
Hi, Ms. Carter. Hi, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Dr. Smiley, thank you. We have, particularly here in the Black and Brown communities that I represent, we call that death by incarceration. And we know that that's used disproportionately in Black and Brown communities. I'm a professor at New York University. I teach forensic justice and problem solving course. And I'm also a formerly incarcerated citizen. So I also represent those individuals and families and communities who are impacted by law enforcement. So when our communities hear of algorithms, when our community hears of the face modeling, and we have to be very frank here. It goes back to the whole idea we all look alike. So we find out that system works very in a very negative way in our communities. So we would hope that would be addressed. Now, one of the things I do want to ask, given the recent comments by Senator Tim Scott and even critics of Vice President Kamala Harris, that's that America is not racist. And I'm putting that as it's a method to my madness. Do you feel that those statements erode the trust in the judicial systems of the communities that we're here, like here in New York? Because if we look at it historically, New York has had one of the highest incarceration rates of Black and brown men, whether that's for marijuana, whether that's for this, and we can go down the list of things, although we represent, I think, 13% of the general population as a whole, disproportionately impacted. How do you, with what you just shared, seek to establish trust, because this is a forum on justice and communities of color, because we know these communities have been disproportionately impacted? How would you what do you say to those Black and brown communities as district attorney in establishing trust that when whatever happens, that you're going to be able to exercise equity and equality on behalf of those communities?
Right. Well, that's a full question. So there's a couple different things to unpack. So first of all, I've been a defense attorney for the past 12 years. So I've been representing everyday New Yorkers for the past 12 years. And this has really informed I have been a prosecutor for 6. I've been a defense attorney for 12. I've kept probably the most people out of jail, minus maybe Eliza Orleans, and I have, really done the work. And I really commend Eliza. She's, public defenders are the lifeblood of the system. And I see that on a day-to-day basis. You can't work in the building for 20 years without acknowledging racism and that it exists. It's just the fact. What I do and say sometimes, that if you look at Black Lives Matter and to the Black Liberation Army in the 60s, in the past 60 years, the wants on the list has been the same. Equal access to opportunity, education, now in a post-corona world, healthcare. It's a 10-point list, but the tenets have remained the same. And so my thing is, when I talk about the criminal justice system, is that racism plays out in the criminal justice system, but it exists before anybody gets arrested, is my point. And people, and that's really where I want to bring the conversation back to when we have conversations about this, because it plays out racially in the criminal justice system. I also take another aspect of it, especially here in Manhattan. It's a lot socioeconomic, and how we treat poor people in this country is really horrible. And in Manhattan, the haves and the have-nots are pretty stark, just because of how the economy works here in Manhattan. So I think it's all these things that go into the criminal justice system, and that the criminal justice system is reflective. I have said this before, and I'll say this again. I have learned it's quite an education to be a defense attorney, because there are bad acts, there are bad decisions, there are bad days, and there are bad circumstances, and you have to look at these things accordingly. It's a micro prism on a macro problem, but you really have to look at each and every case and what are the cases, what are the facts in each and every case, and really look at it and really kind of examine it, allow DAs the discretion to do the right thing. And I think we really have to have a whole, I take a little bit of a take on it differently than my other fellow candidates, because I really believe you have to work with the police. And I think you have to work with the police and work with the tenant leaders and work with the community leaders and the district attorney's office. And when you go and I meet tenant leaders, because you're running for office and you meet different people and different community people in the community, it's like, yes, some of these relationships have started with my campaign 100%, but it's not ending with my campaign. I truly understand what is going on in different neighborhoods and in different things, because I've been listening to it for the past 12 years. And the goal of the next DA has to be to restore public trust, because public trust is eroding neighborhoods. It's eroding neighborhoods because some neighborhoods are higher crime, and those crimes are not getting solved because people do not trust the police. They do not trust going forward to the police to become witnesses in cases, homicides, shootings. These are the things so there's very low clearance rates in high crime neighborhoods. I think that's a huge problem. Then, and then you have the debate versus over policing and under policing. Other big problem. And I mean, these are the things that happen, but the district attorney is not going to fix it. More policing, heavily policing is not going to fix it. And what's going to fix it is having community leaders, tenant leaders, police, and district attorneys really going out and being in the neighborhoods and really having a full dialogue and really establishing independent pathways where tenant leaders and community leaders feel safe enough to talk to the DA, where they don't feel safe enough for the police. And I think there's legislation, which I think is really important, is where neighborhoods can have a say in who is their precinct captain. Because I read that profile in the New Yorker. Did you read the profile in the New Yorker about the 73rd precinct? I thought that was a really interesting piece on, and I do believe that police want to do better. And I understand the hierarchy of the police and the pitfall. I'm not blind to it. I've been working there for 20 years. But I think if we acknowledge what the problems are and really work as a unit together, we can make substantive change. And having, the other thing too that really upsets me sometimes in this race and talking about the racism is that I've been going to 100 Center Street for 20 years on both sides of the courtroom. And I've gone there for 12 years, as a defense attorney, and it's a great education. And you see how this building rises and falls for everyone who comes in there and what that means to them. And it's a big deal. And I understand that. And I want to work to address it. So thanks for the question. Did I answer it?
Yeah, yes, you did.
Yes,
kind of.
Sort of.
Ms. Green, I think you have a question. It looks like you're leaning in for a question. I can feel that.
No, sorry.
I can feel her leaning in. I read that book.
Sure, yeah. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I represent individuals who have had their civil rights violated by the police. And so I want to keep on this question about policing because it's very important to the communities that I represent and interface with every day. And I want to talk a little bit about Brady officers, police officers who are known to have lied under oath or are known bad actors and have committed misconduct. Sometimes you might have a police officer who gives perjured testimony and that particular case is thrown out, or in that particular case where it's come out, the conviction is vacated. My question to you is, what is your position on audits, conducting audits of cases involving a Brady officer where, and in particular, would you audit Brady officer past cases where the Brady officer's testimony was material to the conviction? I'm talking about a situation where it's the police's word versus the defendant's word, and the Brady officer was a key, testimony was key in securing the conviction. So would you audit those cases where involving those Brady officers? And if so, would you look at vacating the convictions of other people who have had their cases been convicted on the basis of Brady officer testimony without extensive investigation into whether or not that individual who was convicted is guilty or innocent?
Right. Well, I'm going to look at each case, and each case, I mean, I think it's troubling when you have these situations. And when presented to me, I would definitely do a thorough investigation. I think what's come out in this campaign is that I do not think, no matter who is the next district attorney, there are going to be conviction integrity, a very robust conviction integrity unit. I think that and I think that what you're talking about falls under the conviction integrity unit, to go in and say, here are the Brady officers, here are the past cases, and we would look on it on a case by case basis. I mean, and so that's where I would fall into it, and that's where I think conviction integrity comes into play, to look at what was going on and what was happening. I think that's a big difference in the different conviction integrity units or a friend of mine is a defense attorney who does a lot of conviction integrity work, and we do talk about this, and there are different standards amongst the different DA offices of what that conviction integrity is and what the standard is for overturning convictions. And it's, can you prove it beyond a reasonable doubt without the testimony versus likely to believe? So I think these are all things that I would do under a conviction integrity unit.
I guess my question is, though, do you have a position right now on what you would do that you could tell constituents? Do you have a position right now on what the standard should be?
Well, the standard should be if you have an officer who has lied under oath on a material matter, the case should be looked at and possibly dismissed if that's what the facts bear out.
And what about that officer's other cases where they testified and you know they've lied under oath in a separate case? What about that officer's other cases? I would examine the other cases, but I'm not committing to. I would examine those other cases, because was he a recovering officer of property, or was he the arresting officer, or was he the eyewitness officer? The question is that whether the testimony was material to the conviction, the officer was played a key role in the conviction. So I'm not talking about a chain of custody issue. I'm talking about officers who have known to lie under oath, and you know they have played a key role in getting other convictions. What are you going to do about those other convictions?
I would investigate all other cases and make a case by case basis.
And that's a commitment that you would make with respect to every Brady officer.
Yeah.
And
I understand that the system does not work unless if everyone is working at a full and a truth-telling way. And if that's not what's happening, then that erodes the whole system. So yeah, I would definitely audit the cases, but I'm not saying that I would dismiss. I would have to look at each case.
And how would you staff your conviction integrity unit to ensure that such an audit could be conducted?
I think that the conviction integrity unit has to be someone who has never been in the office, probably a defense attorney who has worked primarily for the defense bar, and it has to be a separate unit. And I think it has to be staffed by people who have not worked on prior cases in the office.
And you intend to expand the staffing of the conviction integrity unit program at the Manhattan DA's office?
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Ross, questions?
Sure. So I'm executive director of the National Queer API Alliance. So I'll ask you two quick questions that intersect our constituencies. One is in response to the spike in anti-Asian violence and hate, where do you stand on pursuing hate crimes charges? And in response to our community, what would you do in your role to provide safety within the legal framework? And two, what are your policies around diversion program from the criminal justice system for queer and trans youth, particularly queer and trans youth of color?
Ms. Crotty, or Liz rather.
Yeah.
just so you know, you have 1 minute to answer these questions, these two questions.
Okay, well, hate crimes, I think we have to take very seriously. They are enhancements to actual existing crimes. So I think we have to fully prosecute hate crimes. I am a fan of a possible restorative justice when the defendant is going to admit to some wrongdoing. And I think that there's two different kinds of hate crimes. I think there's the lone wolf hate crime, and then there's who plans out a hate attack versus the person who says something while they do a crime, and you can develop intent into a hate crime. And I think that that's where restorative justice comes a little bit more into play. But I do think hate crimes have to be fully prosecuted, fully investigated, and given. And I think we have to have a system where victims are really supported within the DA's office so that we can really work with victims so that they know what is going on. Diversion programs for trans youth. I mean, I think diversion programs have to be done again on a case-by-case basis. And I think that, also too with raise the age, a lot of cases, 16 and 17-year-olds are not, and especially younger ones, are going directly to family court. There is a youth offender part. So that's where I come down on all kids, no matter what.
Okay. Mr. Aliaga, do you have a question? And
Yeah.
Brief answer.
Yes, great. Hi, Attorney Crotty. Jimmy Aliaga. I was a former juvenile offender, was on 2 years of juvenile probation in Virginia before going to law school, became a prosecutor for 3.5 years in Brooklyn, prosecuted cops, and I do plaintiff side class action litigation. You touched on something I wanted to expound on, which is this notion about police in the community and restoring trust. Obviously, every prosecutor and defense attorney knows that when there's no trust in the police, witnesses don't come forward. You need to send cops just to bring the victims to court for trial, and the system doesn't work that way. It seems like your position is that the DA's job is to restore trust in the police versus restore trust in the DA, or basically trying to mend the relationship with the police. And my question is, if the community is telling you, whether it be a garden, a public barbecue, a school, if they're telling you we don't trust the police, where we think that even if we're doing everything lawfully, they will still destabilize the situation. They will not de-escalate what's going on in the schools or the parks. If the community tells you, district attorney, respectfully, we do not want the police in this parts for this event or for the school period or et cetera, what will your stance be when they ask you, will you agree with us and tell the police respectfully to stay out of this community? Because, and this is assuming they have peacekeepers, they have all these other restorative justice components already in place. What will you do in that situation?
Liz, I want to give you time for your closing statement. So please give me 1 minute to answer that question.
I mean, I don't think the district attorney has that kind of authority, to be honest with you. I don't want to backtrack from your question, but that's not what the DA can do. The DA doesn't dictate what the police do.
Yeah, sure, not authority, but just what do you like if they ask you for comment, or what are your thoughts on allowing the community to police itself essentially, or regulate itself without police coming in?
I don't know that an instance where that would happen, and if that would happen, I would listen. But I just don't think that that's. I think that if people say we can't. The district attorney can't say whether or not they come into a police or a community. That's not the role of the DA. If they are not comfortable with the police in that, we have to then work with the police, because the police, you cannot prove cases, and you cannot prove cases. You cannot prosecute cases because generally the police are the ones who make the arrest. So I'm looking at it from a prosecutorial standpoint of that I am not there to restore trust in just the police. I'm there to restore trust in the system, and in trusting in the system, it's what we have to work with the police, but we can't dictate what the police does and does not do in that sense. It is we get the case after an arrest is made. So, I mean, we could always listen, we could always work with the precinct and say, well, why do they not feel comfortable, and go back to this to have conversations and expand on this. But I can't really do one thing about it as the DA besides listen and try and bring the two sides together.
Okay. So thank you very much for all those interesting answers and very good questions. Liz, you have 2 minutes to give us a closing statement to give us your opinion as to why you should be the next DA.
Well, I'm here because I am here running for district attorney because I have been in the courtroom for 2 decades. It's 2 decades of experience of which I bring to this job. I have a vision of how to lead this job to stay objective, to stay fair, and to have public safety in every neighborhood. I think that I do look at it as the district attorney, is different than my colleagues. I do look at this job as a law enforcement job, and that is what the job is. And I think that that's where I come at it from. And I feel as though sometimes reasonable minds will differ on how to do that, but that's my perspective of where I'm coming from and how I would do this. I also know that in doing this, you have to stay objective, you have to stay fair, you have to look at each and every case and the facts of each and every case, and really try and do the best thing by that victim, that defendant, and that community. It is looking at it in that prism that we will get individual fairness. I think some of the things that I want to do in this office are where we really look at misdemeanors. Misdemeanors should be tried within 6 months. And if we do not, if we can't try the case, we should dispose of it. I think we have to really hold, and I think we also have to stop using certificates of readiness to prolong cases. I think we have to really clean up the practices of how orders of protection are used, especially when they're not used in domestic violence or sex crimes cases. I think we have to look at Brady violations. There's been a lot of them. And I think cleaning up the general practice of how the district attorney practices will make monumental change on the people who come there. We need a system that people trust and that services victims, because that is what we're doing. We are trying to help victims being heard while giving defendants a fair shot. That's my campaign. I really appreciate being able to talk to you guys tonight. I appreciate the tough questions. And if you have anything else that you'd like to say, my email is lizcrotty2021@gmail. And I feel free to reach out. I try and answer all my emails by the end of the day. So thanks so much.
Very good. Thank you very much, Liz, for coming. We appreciate you and good luck on the rest of your campaign.
Okay, thanks so much.
All right, have a good night. All right, so next up we have Mr. Court. Mr. Court, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for asking. So like the ones before you, we are going to get right into these questions. They're probably going to be direct questions to the point, hopefully some tough ones, no layups, and see if we can get this thing moving. So first up, we're going to have Professor Huck. Professor, please.
Good evening. My name is Shamtoli Huck. I'm a professor of law at CUNY School of Law, which is I believe the only law school, at least in New York City, with an explicit social justice mission. My questions, the ones that I get to ask you, are really curated from my colleagues, all of whom have deep expertise in the areas that I might ask you on. But let me start with the first one. Seems like everybody is a progressive prosecutor these days. That term gets tossed about. And if I understand, you're sort of in that category as well. But name one thing specifically and concretely that stands you out from the other candidates who also identify themselves as progressive prosecutors. Just very briefly, because I have other questions. Of one thing that stands you out in terms of your view of prosecution or being a progressive prosecutor. Also, if I'm mistaken your background, correct it. If you're like, I'm not a progressive prosecutor, you can tell me that too.
I am a progressive prosecutor. Well, first, thank you, Professor, for the question, but I am a progressive prosecutor, but that's not how I identify myself in this race. I identify myself as a decarceral prosecutor.
Okay.
The very fact that progressive prosecutor is fast becoming one of the two most overused words in races for district attorney. Cy Vanceran is a progressive prosecutor in 2009, and he was the greatest funneler of people to Rikers Island. He's the fact that you're a Democrat and you vote for Joe Biden doesn't make you a progressive, and certainly it didn't.
Just maybe name one thing that stands you out from the candidates.
One specific policy or an overriding theme?
No, one specific policy, concrete, because we're all coming from communities that want to see concrete results. So they can read your policies on your website.
They can read it all.
And I
I'll
also
give
have
one
limited
specific
time.
thing. Penal law section 220. Many people may be very technical, but that's how I would deal with drug cases. All of the candidates, or half of them, have declined to prosecute lists, but I'll go beyond that because declination is not enough. You look at Penal Law 220, 16, 220, 20. We won't get into the specifics. A lot of people on know this, but these are really the worst sort of offenses where you just take the officer's perspective and they're mandatory minimums of 3, 5, or 8 years. And I've said in countless debates, it doesn't get on my declination of prosecution list, but these are the things I'll look to draw down to misdemeanors because it fleeces you, the taxpayer, to these mandatory minimums at $600,000, $700,000. And I think this is a continuation, these two sections of the law on the war on drugs. So it doesn't make it onto the list, but it's something specific I've talked about that nobody else has in the race.
So just on continuing with the declination, as you know, prosecutors have enormous impact on non-citizen immigrant defendants. Would you agree to decline to and commit not to prosecute non-violent offenses where there are immigration consequences? Just yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Would you look at sort of like a conviction integrity unit? Would you be open to creating an immigration integrity unit that looks at all convictions that lead to immigration consequences and perhaps use post-conviction remedies or other tools to vacate that or to mitigate or avoid those consequences?
Yes, and I have the bill in the legislature on amending Penal Law Section 440 that does it. Of course I would, and I would change ECAB, the Early Case Assessment Bureau, to identify that. But you don't have to take my rhetoric for it. I've had a bill for 2 years with legal aid that would reform Section 440 of the penal law, the post-conviction statute, that will get at this problem in one way of getting at this problem. So I'm committed to this issue and reform of the post-conviction, but also identifying these potentially adverse immigration cases pre-arraignment, pre-indictment, because it's often, as you know, Professor, too late to negate immigration consequences once it's post-indictment.
Right. So the last question that I wanted to ask was about sort of community oversight at the stage of deciding whether to prosecute. And as you know, that prosecutors have, no appeals, no oversight really over your decisions. So towards that end of this issue, would you be open to community oversight over your decisions? And if you have an existing policy or proposal, please let us know. So some examples could be an annual audit of your decisions, to have independent experts to review before you arrest, because once the arrest has been put into motion, that it puts immigrant defendants into jeopardy and vulnerability. So, and there could be other examples of it, but just really sort of community oversight at the outset of your decision before prosecuting. Yeah.
I'm certainly open to community participation on policies, oversight. I don't want to promise what I can't deliver, but I'd like to talk to you further about it. It's not a specific policy that I've put forth on my website, but it's something I would consider and think would want to hear from you and the other advocates about what that would look like.
Well, how far would you go? In terms of community participation, what level of your prosecutorial discretion are you willing to share?
Willing to share, I'm willing to share all of it. If you look at my policy on transparency within the sex crimes unit, 14 months ago, I put out a 9-point plan on revamping the sex crimes unit that is ensconced in transparency and disclosure for 2 reasons. One, I have foiled Cy Vance for 5 years and have virtually received no documentation. And 2, I know that the city council oversight over the district attorney's office is skeletal to the point of non-existent. So it's incumbent upon the DA to create not just a portal, but I've said uniquely amongst the candidates, I'll do a document dump on the city council when I go to oversight hearings, whether they ask for the information or not. So there's a second check on what I'm disclosing so that the voters, because the city council actually has a pretty decent website on disclosing data. So I will be fully transparent and community participation, because I've been a community lawyer for 11 years on L&T issues. I'm on the 18B panel representing regular people in Manhattan Criminal Court. It's who I am. But I wouldn't want to agree to a specific set of protocols on oversight, not on oversight, on discretion before I see what those protocols look like. But I'm very open to having that conversation.
I guess I was just asking you, what would you agree to at this moment? What level of oversight would you agree to? But if you want to answer that, or also, I'd take enough time.
I'm not sure is the answer, and I don't want to make something up that
Fair.
to suggest an outcome where I'm not certain what it looks like.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, Mr. Court, I'm going to ask you one question, then we're going to go to Mr. Smiley. Very quick question, and maybe a yes or no. I'm sure as you are an 18B attorney and you've been practicing law for several years, you're aware that certain offices have certain policies related to certain crimes or certain allegations of crime. Will you, as the district attorney, establish a policy whereas certain crimes require mandatory prison time?
I'm sorry, the question is?
Will you establish a policy? Will you have a policy? Will you continue a policy at the DA's office where certain crimes require mandatory prison time from your office?
No.
Okay, and this includes violent crimes as well as non-violent crimes?
That's correct. I've put forth a plan on sentencing reform. I think sentences longer, I'll have a rebuttable presumption against any sentence over 20 years, regardless of the crime. Similar to what Larry Krasner in Philadelphia has put forth, as well as Rachel Rollins in Boston. So no, I have to deal with statutory minimums that the legislature has set, and I'm working on that this very day, in this very week in the legislature. But I will, within my discretion, I will limit sentences as much as humanly possible. And I gave the example to the professor before, how I will use my discretion within charges to reduce the outcome of longer sentences.
Okay, very good. Mr. Smiley, please.
Hi, my name is Calvin Smiley. I'm a professor at Hunter
Wait a minute.
College.
I'm sorry. Stop. I said Mr. again. Dr. Smiley.
I wasn't going to cut you off.
Yes, you did. Go ahead and cut me off. It's okay. Cut me off. Say, yo, X, it's Dr. Smiley.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Let's start over. Sorry, Mr. Court. Dr. Smiley, go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Dr. Smiley. I'm a professor in the sociology department at Hunter College and a faculty affiliate in the Roosevelt House School for Public Policy, where I teach courses on criminal justice, race, etc. So I was really intrigued by your stating that you're the decarceral prosecutor. And that kind of leads into one of my main questions I've been asking. And, since the high profile deaths of people like George Floyd and others, we've seen a growing abolitionist movement that has really sought out transformative change, starting with the hashtag defund the police. So could you tell us your interpretation of the defund movement, as well as how, if you're elected, you plan to incorporate, if at all, any of the demands surrounding this growing social movement?
Well, I've been an advocate in the reduction of the NYPD budget for a long period of time, and will do so as district attorney. The fact that I don't control the city budget doesn't mean that I lose my voice. I can use the bully pulpit of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to not caucus with the regressive voice, that's the District Attorneys Association. And concurrent with that, I can use my voice and my practical experiences to work with the Manhattan delegation and potentially the next speaker of the city council, who's likely Manhattanite, to at least influence the process by which we reallocate resources from the NYPD to various not-for-profit providers that do a much better job. It's not the elimination of the NYPD. I'm not saying I support that. But just because something's not within my legislative purview, I don't lose the ability to participate. And I know the power of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, but that power is also can be the power to remain silent. And that says something as well. And I'm not going to avail myself. If I win this primary and I put my views on decarceration before the voters, then I believe I have the right to opine about things beyond the purview of the penal law. And I plan to do that, whether that makes me popular or not. This is not a job that someone who wants to be popular as the most primary thing should run for. This is a job about principle and being willing to say and do what you want and accept the consequences of a level of conflict and unpopularity in your political life. And maybe since I'm the only one who's been on the ballot before, and been through the rigors of political campaigns, I understand that better than the other 7.
Sure. And just as a quick follow-up, so with the growing number of elderly incarcerated individuals in the state prison system, how likely are you to review cases, particularly for elderly or infirmed persons who've been incarcerated, particularly those who've been incarcerated, 10, 15, 20 plus years, and really consider promoting release for those individuals?
I will do everything humanly possible I can to get these people out. Elder parole in the state legislature is one of the ways. I will even go to extraordinary means. The professor probably knows, and others, Penal Law Section 440 doesn't have a good cause release mechanism, but I will, for lack of a better word, work in collusion with legal aid and other public defender organizations to get these people out. One of the saddest things I've ever seen was last month or 6 weeks ago when I went to Fishkill facility as a legislative trip to see they have a dementia floor. They have an elderly floor, 75, 80-year-old, mostly men with dementia. And this obviously affects me personally, family members in that realm. What good are we doing? What does it say for us as a society that this is happening? So I will use every mechanism possible, both in my voice with the legislature to achieve elder parole, but also within the powers of my own office to get these people out, who, as we all know, pose no public safety threat to anybody.
Sure. And if I could squeeze one more quick question in just for my time.
Of course.
Going through your website as opposed to other candidates, what really struck me was you have a section on animal rights. And I, as an animal lover myself and someone, could you just elaborate on how that would look, as well as how do you plan to traverse the tricky potential nature of potentially prosecuting people that are people of color with certain cultural practices, and how will that play out where you might be going after someone who's practicing Santeria but not going after the French restaurants that are selling foie gras? So you can just kind of tell us about that a bit.
No, it's a good question, Doctor. One, I know you didn't mean this when you said it, but it's been so often used in this campaign. The district attorney doesn't quote unquote go after people, or at least I don't. That's I know you didn't mean it, but I hear it all the time from some of my opponents, mostly the prosecutors. We're going to go after this, go after that. That's a carceral worldview, that we go after things. We don't do that. We seek to achieve justice. Sometimes prosecution is the aims or the tactic to achieve justice, but that's a mindset that has led to fueling incarceration, one that as a non-prosecutor, I don't share. Secondly, I'll look to the existing laws on animal cruelty, on ones that I've supported and voted for. And also this is an area where money, wire fraud, the conspiracy laws could come into play, where you look at people who file false instruments. And it's more about accountability than long jail sentences for me, because from the corrections committee, from my worldview, I have no faith that any stay in a state correctional facility will lead to any sense of rehabilitation. It is a policy failure when anyone has to be incarcerated. That will happen under my watch, but it's going to happen for a short as period of time as possible.
Okay, Mr. Ross, any questions for Mr. Court?
Sure, and it's actually interesting that you have a pet policy. Pet policies, that's, I just got back from feeding the cat. So I'm executive director of the National Queer API Alliance, and I'll limit my question to one of the issues there's a priority for us, which is addressing anti-Asian violence, particularly in New York City. Just today, there's footage of a woman being beaten by with a hammer. And there's been a robust debate around whether prosecutors should pursue hate crimes charges against individuals across the board, including those that are obviously vulnerable and already systems involved. So my question is, what is your take on addressing the spike in violence, specifically on the calls for hate crimes charges, and generally in terms of how do we build a system that addresses the individual incidents, but also community safety for API communities and broadly for the city?
It's a critical question, and I've been following this unfortunate trend through the state level with increases in anti-Asian hate crimes over the last year, but it's also been rising in other communities as well. The Jewish community in Manhattan, as well as the continuation of hate crimes against the African-American community as well. I think the sufficiency of the existing laws with respect to misdemeanor and felony assault laws are certain enough that I have the tools within my arsenal to prosecute individuals, and I will, for the horrendous crime that happened on 125th Street, as well as this most recent attack with the hammer. But I think you're asking about the felony bump up and the hate crime, and I have said publicly, I do not support its use. I think I have sufficient tools within my arsenal to hold people accountable and ensure a level of appropriate incarceration with all the penal law sections under 7D02, specifically the felony assault charges, which would be applicable in the description of the cases you made. Secondly, and I think we need to talk about this, is the failures are deep, they're systemic, they're policy failures. But if you look at all the community organizations that are involved in education, whether from running the gamut, from the not-for-profits for the Anti-Defamation League, they're all talking about greater investment in education, early education, middle school, high school. That's where the breakdown most occurs. That doesn't mean you're not going to prosecute. Ultimately, I will prosecute these cases, but in the long-term systemic solutions or reforms to lesser this evil in our society, it's going to take a wholesale effort on education and practicing what we preach. It's not just the rhetoric of diversity, it's the teaching of that in middle school and high school, to reduce that level of hatred in our society, especially here in Manhattan, which you're seeing a lot over the last 6 months to a year.
Mr. Court, I'm sorry to interrupt really quickly, and I'll let one of the panelists ask another question, but I just want to be clear what the record is on what you're saying about hate crimes. So is it your position that you are not going to seek the bump up for allegations or facts that may relate to hate crime activity?
No, I'm saying I'm going to use the existing felony laws to deal with that a 5-year jail sentence or a 3-year jail sentence is sufficient, that you don't need the bump up to get someone another 2, 3, 4 years. That's my view. And I think history, unfortunately, has proven us right that longer sentences are not the long-term solution. So I guess yes is the answer to your question, sir.
Okay, very good. All right. Ms. Green, do you have any questions for Mr. Court?
Yes, Mr. Court. My name is Emilia Green. I represent individuals who have had their civil rights violated by the police. I also represent a lot of people who have been wrongfully convicted, including individuals who have been wrongfully convicted and exonerated by the current conviction integrity program in Manhattan, which has not gotten a lot of exonerations, but I do represent Rafael Ruiz, who's one person who has come out of that program. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about your position on conviction integrity units and programs. Do you agree that conviction integrity should include reexamination of excessive sentences and review of applications for clemency? And if so, I know each of the candidates have talked a lot about what they're going to do with the conviction integrity program, but how would you incorporate that into what you would do as district attorney?
Well, I appreciate the question. My general view is that, and this is not, Cy Vance's conviction integrity unit is a joke. You know that. Everyone knows that it's not, it's a conviction reaffirmation unit. But I come from a fundamental belief that district attorneys' offices are ill-equipped to second look themselves. And that's why I wrote statewide legislation that would create a conviction integrity agency. Because if you look across the 62 counties of New York State, few district attorneys' offices, in fact, have conviction integrity units. And those that have them don't function all that well, Manhattan being the prime example. So I think the long-term solution is create a state agency that addresses these cases and fund it accurately. And that's why I wrote legislation to that effect. That being said, it's unlikely my bill will pass before hopefully I'm the next district attorney. So this will be something that's in my purview. Yes, to your question, it will be beyond just guilt or innocence. It'll look at excessive sentencing. It'll also look at were there possible discovery reforms, discovery violations, Brady violations on this case. Secondly, it almost be creating a law firm within the law firm of the district attorney's office. There will be no prosecutors, second-looking prosecutors' work. They'll be separate and distinct. It'll be defense attorneys. They will be adequately funded. And then they'll report back to me on their findings. And ultimately, it'll be my decision on what to do. That's what the voters, the power that the voters give me to make that decision. That's how I would create and change the conviction integrity unit. But I wanted to give you a little background of where I come from on this, not having great faith based upon my view of district attorney's offices in New York City, of really being the place where you can go to second look themselves.
And so just to drill down a little bit more on that, thanks for your response on that. When you say you will look at excessive sentencing, what exactly do you mean by that? There are many Black and brown people who believe they've received an excessive sentence. What type of confines are you looking at in terms of what you would actually implement?
Well,
and wait, before you answer that question, Mr. Court,
yes,
you have 3 minutes to give us a closing statement. So if you would incorporate Ms. Green's answer for about a minute, and then give us a 2-minute closing statement if you can.
I'd rather answer the questions. You've heard all the platitudes of closing statements, so I'll give longer answers and shorter closings.
I like that.
I'm sorry?
I like that.
Since I know you know more about this than I do, Ms. Green, the problems are the confines of the law and where I can go on Section 440, and that there's no catch-all that it's very difficult to just say these sentences are obscene. And you're not going to get any relief from this governor and this parole board. And I've worked with clergy over the last 5 years, many who are supporting me in this race and trying to get greater diversity in our parole boards. But waiting for a governor, any governor on clemency, we're going to be sorely disappointed as we are today. I will use every tool possible I have, but 440, the section that would get people out, doesn't give me a ton of leeway, but I'll try, and I'll push it to the appellate divisions to overturn me. That's the best I can do, not because that's the best I want to do, but I have limitations in the law right now, and I'll push it right up to the limit, and I'm willing to get overturned on appeal because, at least I'll get the person out. But I can do more on the front end, unfortunately, with sentencing reform. Undoing the harm of Cy Vance and the past 20, 25 years is much more difficult than what I can do prospectively. So I want to be, at least give you an honest answer. I'll do everything I can, but the law does not give me great leeway on what I can do to just get people out of our state correctional facilities as much as I would like to.
Okay, so you have actually 1.5 minutes left, but Mr. Aliaga has a question. So if you can, Mr. Aliaga, if you could ask your question, Mr. Court, if you can answer that question within a minute, and then we can give you a 30-second closing statement. That's up to you. But thank you very much.
I can do that.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Aliaga. Let's see.
Sounds good. Let's try it out. Hi, Attorney Court. So you said something in an earlier debate when we were talking about prosecutorial misconduct and bad police officers, and you said it comes down to the individual prosecutor. And that's something that I'd like you to expound on here. If you win the election and you're looking at your list of ADAs, it's no secret, right? People become prosecutors to get trial experience, go into government, go to the federal, go to defense side, whatever it is, but trials are the metric, right? And you're looking at now, how do you clean house, so to speak, or who do you keep, who do you reform, who do you abandon? What's your mindset for looking at line ADAs who may have come into the job with a carceral position and now have to change, and supervisors? How do you evaluate them? Who do you keep, who do you not keep? What do you do?
That's a great question. I would do 3 things, but I start with the premise that I think distinguishes me a little from the other people in this race. Many people in this race think because they're different than Cy Vance, because they're, quite frankly, a better person or have better ideas, that the office is going to change simply because of that. I suffer under none of those illusions. The only way I'm going to change the office is with wholesale changes. Larry Krasner came into Philadelphia and within a year, 28% of the office turned over. That would equate with 160 ADAs within the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. That's the change I'm looking at. Just changing the leadership team, that's not going to be enough. There are bureau chiefs and assistant bureau chiefs who I take no glee in doing this, but if I'm ever going to reform this office and not get beat by my own office, there's going to have to be changes. And I respect people, but I will wish them well in the private sector and just say, we don't share the same vision and it's best that you work elsewhere. Secondly, I'll recruit differently. Now the DA's office recruits from across the country. I think that's a bad idea. I can get diversity and excellence right here from New York City law students. I'll create a pipeline with deans of New York City law schools. Give me that 28-year-old who's working during the day, goes to CUNY at night or goes to St. John's or Brooklyn at night. Maybe they're not on law review, but maybe they're in the top 20, 30% of their class. That's the ADA I want because they know a little bit something about New York City and the individual defendant who sits across from them in the courtroom. And last, I'll use some of the forfeiture fund money on offsetting loan costs. And this is critical. We lose so many third-year ADAs after they do their 3-year term because they just can't, the money, you just can't keep them. And I can't pay them so much more. But what I can do is offset some of the loan costs. 90% of ADAs, 90% of applications to the federal program for loan forgiveness are rejected. I hope Biden gets it better than Trump and that number changes. But until it does, I want to have a chance at keeping some of these new recruits and new class of lawyers so they can move up the chain to bureau chief and assistant bureau chief. And I think one of the ways I can do that is at least take some of these loans off their back because it's these working class kids who have these loans. It's not the upper middle class kids. They don't have, they're not saddled with 200 grand in debt. So I want to make it a little easier to keep these ADAs, a new class of diverse and excellent ADAs, so I get them into bureau chief and assistant bureau chief level by year 6 or 7. That's how I'm going to change the office. I'll be different. I'll be different than Vance, but that's not enough to change the office. It'll take day after day of policy changes and sticking with it. And that's what I'm committed to. It won't be an easy job, but being a good Manhattan District Attorney was never intended to be easy.
All right. So Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that was your closing statement. So thank you very much. Even though you didn't want one, that was a good one.
I will incorporate my last answer as a closing argument, Counselor.
Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. And we wish you well in the rest of your candidacy. Okay, so next up we have Tali Weinstein. I believe she's in the waiting room, or she's there, or where? Oh, there you are.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm fantastic, actually. I'm up. I'm shaking my head. I'm chilling. I'm good. So, so the way we're doing this, I think is that we are going to get right into some questioning, and we want to ask you hopefully some direct, maybe tough, maybe not questions, and hopefully you'll give us some good direct answers, and hopefully your voters, our voters, everyone's voters will be more informed, and we'll get some good information. So we want to start off with Mr. Coffey, who's sitting over there, leaning back in his chair, ready to ask a fantastic question. Sir, please begin.
Hi, Tali. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a professor at New York University where I teach forensic justice and problem-solving course. So thank you so much for being here. And jumping right into it. I think in the past 20 years, there hasn't been a notion, just the facts that the district attorney's office has not been diverse with people of color in this office. How do you seek to diversify this office that's reflective of the New York City?
Well, thank you so much. And let me just say off the bat, I agree both with your account of the facts and also what the values that are underlying them. This has to change. And in the Brooklyn DA's office, where I was the general counsel and part of the leadership structure, we made a concerted and successful effort to hire differently and to make sure that the folks who were coming in lived in the communities that we were working in and looked like Brooklyn. And I would bring the same approach to Manhattan. And we had excellent and diverse incoming classes in the 2 years that I was there. So I know that it can be done. I also look to DA Gonzalez's example because it's not just about the beginning of the pipeline. You need to have diversity, at every part of the process. And he really thoughtfully put together a team that was balanced in many ways by race, also by gender. In fact, his entire leadership team, I think, but one in the years that I was there were some shifts, were comprised of women, for example. I can tell you just as a candidate when I'm out there how important it is for people to feel that change is personified. I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman, those would be two firsts in this office. And just seeing the feedback and the reaction to that has been really important to me and fortified this very thing.
Okay, thank you. Also, I just want to add, for the sake of this conversation, I'm also a formerly incarcerated citizen. I represent Black and Brown communities, formerly incarcerated citizens, et cetera, who have went through our criminal justice system. And like we were just mentioning something in regards to Larry Krasner and how he came into that office and really just shook things up. What are 3 things that you think you could promise the Black and Brown communities that have been disproportionately impacted regarding sentencing within the district attorney's office today that you see yourself executing within the first, let's say, 30 to 60 days in office? Walk in, we're going to change. What would that look like?
Yeah. So as you know, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted in every part of the criminal justice system, and whether they are defendants, the people accused and charged of crimes, or the victims of crimes. Lots of studies that show that when violence occurs against Black and Brown people, prosecutors don't care, police don't care the way they would if it were happening to a white person or a white family. And that has always deeply troubled me. For example, in my focus on domestic violence, just the stunningly different treatment that I have seen women of color get versus white women when they are suffering from this crime. So 3 things I'm going to do off the bat that have a racial justice lens to them. And this is just the beginning. I wish I could say more than 3 things. 1, take on gun violence. The victims of gun violence in this year, that has been the deadliest year since 2012, have been disproportionately people of color. 2, transform the way we deal with gender-based violence. And 3, create a post-conviction justice bureau in Manhattan, like the one I created in Brooklyn. The one in Brooklyn is the first of its kind in the entire country, to say that if we're going to get at mass incarceration, we can't just think about who we're sending into the criminal justice system, but also need to understand our responsibility to folks who are already incarcerated and, of course, are disproportionately people of color. So that includes wrongful convictions. I supervise the premier conviction review unit in the entire country. I'm actually the only person in this field of 8 who has ever done an exoneration. It's hard work, it's different work, it requires different skills. We also published a report, because reckoning is a part of racial justice, that with the Innocence Project, we looked back at the first 25 wrongful convictions in Brooklyn and just put out there, what happened? What did prosecutors do wrong? What did police do wrong? What did courts do wrong? And 24 out of those 25 cases involved Black or Latino defendants. 24 out of 25 of them were men, just to bring your focus to one area where you see this in the starkest terms. 426 years lost collectively to wrongful incarceration in that group. That's the name of the report. You could read it online. I set up programs to support parole, clemency, excessive sentencing, sealing past convictions, expunging some convictions, all within this post-conviction justice bureau. And I expect it to be a big part of the Manhattan DA's office that I'm going to build from scratch.
And my last question, just one more question.
Sure.
As far as prosecutorial misconduct in your office, how are you seeking to address any DA under you that you find that has acted out of accordance with the mission and values that you have stated, in the essence of that idea of the conviction culture, or that thing?
Yeah. Well, so from the top, if you intentionally commit misconduct in my office, you intentionally violate the codes of ethics or the law, you get fired. And I also have never been opposed to having an external body. I just think they never proposed the right one in the New York State legislature to refer prosecutors to in some circumstances for investigation and decision about misconduct. But your question is an interesting one because it was also a question about cultural change. And a lot of what goes wrong is not a prosecutor intentionally taking the Brady material and throwing it into the fireplace. Okay? I mean, we have to say that. It's people are poorly trained. They are not set up to succeed. There's a culture of not asking questions before the mistake happens. And that's a lot harder to fix. Part of it is to change the evaluation system, as we did in Brooklyn, so that convictions are not the measure of success. Instead, success is, how did you handle your case? Did you produce your discovery on time? Did you treat everybody with respect? Did you investigate fully to make sure to get to the real bad actors rather than a superficial glide in your case? How did defense counsel report on interacting with you, and so on? I think that that is a meaningful change. We have to have what Barry Scheck calls a just culture so that people feel comfortable coming forward. I was this person in Brooklyn. So one of my responsibilities as general counsel was to be the ethics and professional responsibility officer. It meant anyone could come and say, you know, my supervisor is telling me something to do, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's right. It's not what I would do. I feel the pressure, you know, and to talk about it before the problem develops, and for people to feel comfortable having that conversation, that's a major cultural change. And then I think we have to train our ADAs better, not just sort of throw them into the fire and hope for the best. I want the people who work for me to be set up to succeed.
Okay. Mr. Aliaga, please. You look like you were leaning in to ask a question.
Thank you. Hi, Fadi Weinstein, Miss Fadi Weinstein. I'm an alumni of Brooklyn, and I want to thank you because Law Enforcement Accountability Bureau was my favorite bureau while I was at the office. And I started there because many years ago, I, at 17, was at a house party, was standing next to my friends, and there was a group of white kids, and we were the group of non-white kids. The police officers show up, as they do at house parties. They let the white kids go. They kept the Black and brown kids there. I know I'm very conscious of white privilege here, but I still was lumped in with this category. Long story short, we received constructive possession charges for drugs that were not ours. A judge decided to throw the case out, but ever since then, that story stuck in my head, that experience. And at the DA's office, I did indict an officer for perjury. And the reason I'm bringing all this up now is when you were talking about intentional misconduct and prosecutorial misconduct, I agree. A lot of times it's not a prosecutor throwing Brady into the fire. I'm wondering how you will look at prosecutorial neglect, because in a lot of these instances where police officers commit perjury, where they do anything wrong, essentially, once the arrest is made, either to cover their own misconduct before or to bump up charges. Why didn't the ADA take an extra second to talk to another officer, to talk to officers in different rooms, to and it may come down to training, but I'm curious, when you have your law enforcement accountability operation set up in Manhattan, and you find out that, yes, an officer did lie about video, where does that investigation go next? Do you look at the prosecutors who originally handled that case, and how do you start ferreting out, well, what can we do about this? And was there a prosecutorial neglect here? And if so, how would you handle it as a DA?
Yeah.
And Tally, if you can,
yeah,
I need you to try to answer that question in a minute or a minute and a half.
Oh, well, can I use just 10 seconds to say how happy I am to see Jimmy, who worked in the unit that I built in Brooklyn, and I was sad when he left the office, and I hope that you—
No, you can't say that.
Well and thriving since I last saw you, Jimmy. That don't count that against my time. Okay. Look, listen, it's a great question. First of all, as you know, from when you were in that unit, the first thing is you prosecute the police officer for false statements, for lying under oath. We did bring charges in Brooklyn for things like saying you saw something, a police officer that was contradicted by a video, tampering with evidence, really demanding integrity, because those crimes, when committed by police officers, degrade trust in the system. And look, I think you're absolutely right that when an incident like that happens, you do have to look at everyone around it who enabled it, right? I mean, this is what we're also understanding as a society, that there is systemic racism, systemic prejudice that isn't just about one person being a rotten apple, but about people through incompetence or something else perpetuating these problems. So I absolutely think that's a really good practice to do a deep dive on everybody who has touched a case where there has been a false statement that's moved on or something like it. Sort of like they do in medical school, where they, will put up something that went wrong and try to figure out, well, who are all of the actors who contributed to this in some way.
Okay. Ms. Green, please.
Just a quick question, just following up on your comments on changing the culture in the office. Would you agree that it would be very difficult to change the culture without cleaning house, so to speak? There are many folks who believe you can say anything you want about training, but if you have someone who's been a line prosecutor for the last 20 years operating under a particular culture, that culture is not going to change until you move those people out and bring different people in. What's your views on that? Would you be cleaning house if you became the DA? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
Yeah. So Amelia, there isn't a short answer to this question, because I think it's going to be some of each thing. So I think the best practice, and the best practice I will put into place, is to re-interview every single person who works there when I come in, all 600 lawyers, all 600 support staff. I don't think that anybody is entitled to work in the Manhattan DA's office or in any other position of trust like that. What the people are entitled to is to have the best people. And I expect that what I would find is what we found in Brooklyn, when DA Gonzalez likewise came in with a different agenda and a different approach to prosecution. I think that there will be some people who have to go for the reasons that you described. Some people who are hardworking public servants who have been doing this work in the right way and can continue, and others who are open to a different path and a different way of succeeding. I had a lot of positive experiences in Brooklyn with folks who'd been there for a really long time, right? And I came in as part of the new regime as an outsider in a way, and I found that to go back to the question of just culture that we talked about before, that there was a lot of positive experience and reception to saying, well, now you can ask those questions. You could do this differently. You don't have to ask for the longest sentence. You can use your power to do justice in this case. And one of the things that I did in the Post-Conviction Justice Bureau, where we reviewed cases that we would support for parole and clemency, is I didn't want to have a top-down approach. So I had a standing meeting with chiefs, chief of the Homicide Bureau, chief of domestic violence, all these folks to work through these cases together and to create a new culture inside that process, not just saying this is how it's going to be.
Thanks.
Xavier, you're on mute. I think you're trying to.
I'm sorry. I've been doing that a lot lately. I'm trying to give you all. Professor, do you have any questions for Tali?
Yes. Hi, how are you doing? I'm Shamtoli Haq. I'm a professor at CUNY School of Law. So my questions are yes, no. They're related to immigration and criminal law intersections. So just answer them yes or no. Okay. So the first part is, as a prosecutor, that your decisions have devastating impact on non-citizen immigrant defendants. Padilla versus Kentucky advises criminal defense attorneys that have an ethical obligation to immigrant defendants. Do you agree that prosecutors have a legal and ethical obligation to mitigate and avoid immigration consequences as part of their work? Yes or no?
Yes, we did that in Brooklyn. I think we're the
Great.
only place in the state I'm
Thank
aware
you.
of.
Thank you. Great.
Yes or no?
Hmm?
Go ahead, Professor. I'm sorry.
Yeah, to minimize harm to defendants, would you decline and commit not to prosecute low-level non-violent offenses like misdemeanors, petty larceny, or criminal possession? These are just examples. Will you decline to prosecute low-level non-violent offenses?
Sometimes, not always.
Okay. Would you agree to adopt, or have you already adopted, a written plea policy requiring your DAs to consider avoiding or mitigating immigration consequences?
Yes.
What, do you have a policy in place?
I've said that should be a part of every charging decision, whether charging or pleas throughout, considering the collateral consequences in terms of immigration.
Just to go back to the first, give me an example of crimes where you would decline and commit not to prosecute categorically.
From the immigration perspective,
yeah.
No, it's not categorical, but in every case, we thought about what the charging consequences would have on an immigrant.
Okay, you'll do a case-by-case basis, but you will not adopt to any policy of like declination across the board.
That's specific to non-citizens, no.
Okay, good to. The last question, just a switch of the question, is around community oversight. As you know, prosecutors have little to no oversight over their prosecutorial decisions. Would you be open to community oversight of your prosecutorial discretion? For example, before deciding to take a charge forward. It also goes the other way, right? Declining not to prosecute in terms of hate crimes, or I think that immigrant communities also find that offices don't prosecute crimes. So would you be open to community oversight over your prosecutorial decisions or discretion? And I can give some examples if that helps.
I need to understand better what that would look like, because that's also, I mean, like a grand jury investigation is secret. So I don't know how you could bring the community into specific.
Before you decide to prosecute, and you can take that question however you want, of where could the community have input or oversight over your decisions and discretion?
I think the community can have input over policies. It's harder
in terms of the decision to prosecute, not policy.
Individual cases.
Yes.
No.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Smiley or Mr. Ross, either have any questions for Tali? Mr. Smiley, Mr. Ross, I have a question for you, Tali. A very quick question.
Sure.
So just before you came on, Dan was talking about forfeiture and the money he would use to help, I guess, ward off some of the loans that some of his assistants may have should he be elected. I guess my question to you is there anything else you can think of that you would do with, let me preface it with this. We are aware that the Manhattan DA's office, similar to the Southern District of New York, probably takes in several millions of dollars each year in forfeiture money. Do you have any plans for that forfeiture money?
Yeah, I've heard Dan say that. I'm confused because he's also said that he won't take criminal asset forfeiture anymore. So that's one question. And I also, my understanding of the law is that you cannot use it to pay back people's loans.
So no, my question, what would you do with it?
Right, so not that. I think that three principles guide how I want to use it. It's the people's money. It has to be a participatory process in some way. It has to be transparent, and it has to be measured after the fact to know, is the stuff that we're choosing working? I mean, in the end, I think the point of that money is to put us out of business, right? To make communities healthier and safer so that there is less crime.
I want you to give me one thing you would do with that money. Give me one thing.
Support proven gun violence and intervention programs that stop violence before it occurs. Support educating young people about domestic violence and sexual assault. And how to proceed. Support immigrants in understanding their rights in the criminal justice system. I mean,
that was three. See, that was three. I asked you for one. See, look at
well,
See, there you
I
go.
can keep going.
There you go. So it's 8:55. I think it's time for us to ask you if you want to provide us a 90-second closing statement, if you can do it in 90 seconds.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And I can see from your questions how committed you are to changing the face of the office, the approach of this office, to make sure that it does what I think it was always meant to do, which is to look out for the most vulnerable, to make sure that we are protecting them both within the system and with the powers of the system, to keep people safe from violence, from abuse, from theft, all of the ways that hold people back. And I hope that I'm going to be able to work with all of you in doing that. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. And good luck on the rest of your candidacy.
Thank you so much. Good night.
You're very welcome. Good night. Okay, so last but not least, we have Mr. Alvin Bragg, who's coming to speak with us. Mr. Bragg, like we've said with the other candidates, we're going to get right to the questions, and we have about 15, 20 minutes to do that. And so we're going to start with Mr. Smiley. Dr. Smiley. You know what? I'm going to owe you dinner.
We're going to have to give you like a nickel jar every time you mess up. You're going to throw a nickel in the jar.
You're taking me back to my youth.
I think he offered you dinner. I think you wanted to move away from the nickel. It's been inflation.
I'm going with the nickel. I'm going with the nickel. You said it. I'm taking the nickel.
You know, I was trying to be.
I'm taking the nickel.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being here with us tonight. As said, I'm Dr. Calvin Smiley. I'm a professor, assistant professor in the sociology department at Hunter College, and faculty affiliate at the Roosevelt House Public Policy School, where I teach courses on race and criminal justice. So my first question is, since the death of George Floyd and other high-profile deaths of Black and brown residents across the United States, we've seen a growing abolitionist movement on the rise that really wants to seek out transformative change, starting with the hashtag defund the police. Could you tell us your interpretation of the defund movement, as well as how, if elected, you plan to incorporate, if at all, any of the demands surrounding this growing social movement?
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you. I'm familiar with your work. Thank you for your work. You know, I stood last summer with some of them, actually my clients, in a matter that I'm working on with folks who are outside of City Hall calling for a $1 billion plus cut. I looked at the budget, and there are specific areas I've identified that add up to that number, which is why I joined. The first is homeless sweeps. My dad ran homeless shelters. I used to walk around Harlem and the Upper West Side, you know, talking to the people who would spend the nights in the shelters. You know, we've got several city agencies that have core competencies in that. It's not what the police are to do. So I would move them out of that. The second is mental health responses. Again, we have people trained in the city to do that. I know you're familiar with the Cahoots model in Oregon. We got a pilot project in East Harlem and Harlem now. I think it needs to be scaled up. And it's literally a matter of life and death. I've done a lot of police accountability work. Of those killed by the police, 25% to 50% start with a mental health call. So it's not just, you know, policy wonkishness, right? This is life or death. That's the second area. And the third area is schools. My mom was a career educator. Kind of the litmus test I use is, if my mom or dad could do it, the police shouldn't be doing it. I'm saying that seriously. They were you know, people who did a lot of work for the community. I grew up in Harlem and Manhattan and had a lot of skills. And so she's an educator, and I look at our schools, you know, no psychologists, large class size, but yet militarized police. And I've worked on many of these areas. When I was at the Attorney General's office, we investigated 2 school districts upstate. They had zero tolerance disciplinary policies, the kind of stuff that, you know, in my day would have maybe got you sent to the principal. If you're Black or brown, get you sent to the precinct. And so we changed that. We used the power of the law, shifted them to restorative justice policies, and we saw the impact, particularly on Black and brown students. So those are 3 areas that add up to, you know, the number that the activists were calling for. And I would note, you know, that's less than the growth that we've seen under de Blasio of the budget. So it sounds like a very big number. But also, you know, as I think some of you may know, and I'm happy to talk more broadly about my background, you know, I've done real public safety prosecutions. So I definitely talk about what I want the police to do. As a federal prosecutor, I prosecuted, you know, the owner of a multi-million-dollar business who was laundering millions of dollars for a violent international cartel. My theory of prosecution is you follow the money and the contraband person or people, you hold them accountable, and you see the public safety benefits. And we saw that with that case. We turned off the money supply to that cartel, or at least a part of the cartel, and we saw the benefits. So that's my theory.
Okay.
Great. And then just a follow-up question. I appreciate those answers, very specific ways in which you would move the money. But with the growing number of elderly incarcerated individuals in the state prisons, are you to review cases of both elderly or infirm persons who've been incarcerated, particularly for decades? We're talking 20 plus years. And would you give that real consideration for promoting their release?
Definitely. I support the elder reform bill that's in Albany. One of my supporters I've gotten to know, and you may be familiar, she wrote a great op-ed in the Washington Post last year as a geriatric doctor at Rikers. And some of the people Rachel Bedard, in case you're not, you may know her name, and I've talked a lot with people will be shocked at the people that we have incarcerated. And so I fully support that. And I also support, changing the law so that we can do look backs and reevaluate long sentences, not just based obviously on conviction review and integrity, but just on sentences that are long and serve absolutely no purpose. So I would go beyond the current law that's proposed and go further.
Okay. Mr. Ross, any questions for Mr. Bragg?
Sure. So I'll ask a specific one and then a more holistic one. So, sorry, it's been a long night. Specifically, in response to spike in anti-Asian hate violence, what would be your approach, one, specifically on adding and pursuing hate crimes charges, as some in our community have demanded? And generally, how would you approach both the individual instances which shock the city, but beyond that, how would you move towards a policy of community safety and community investment within the parameters of the DA's office? And that's question one. And two, given that the DA is a elected office and impacts people's lives, it's in my opinion, much more of an executive function than most of the races are on ballot, because you get to make decisions that, for example, a city council person doesn't within your purview. Yet most New Yorkers probably will not participate in this election, don't have an idea of what a DA does. And for marginalized communities, their interaction is highly negative with the DA's office and grossly unfair. So how would you involve community, particularly communities that have been most disproportionately impacted by the policies of the DA's office, in a way that is holistic and positive?
Great. So on the first question about hate crimes, I've worked, so just as my started out my career early in my career in the public corruption unit in the Attorney General's office, and with a foot in the Civil Rights Bureau. And so back then, looking at the hate crime law, which is relatively new. More recently, as chief deputy overseeing the entire office of more than 1,500, when Trump was elected, we reached out to all law enforcement in the state. We saw an uptick in hate crimes, and we said, "Look, y'all have to do something about this." And we broke down the statute and the ways to investigate. And then last year, as a candidate, I convened a panel with leaders from the Asian American community, someone handling the Charlottesville case, and others. So I've been working on this for some time. I've been really disappointed with the NYPD in particular. The NYPD spokesperson recently articulated that, hey, we don't view things as a hate crime unless there's national origin discrimination articulated at the scene. That's not the statute. I've been talking about that. I was on 60 Minutes Politico talking about that. It's a shame when the NYPD spokesperson gets it wrong. So I think the DA needs to be stepping into the breach. We need to have a direct line in to the DA. Part of the issue is also we don't have the kind of established community relationship, which will go to the second part of your question, which we need, which would help this. But really fundamentally wrong to have the wrong standard of law. And so what I would be doing is having kind of a common sense inclusionary investigatory approach, right? So, someone's in Chinatown and they don't work there and they don't live there and they commit an assault. According to the NYPD, if the person doesn't say something, it's just an assault and we're not going to make it a hate crime. That goes against our common sense. What do you do as a prosecutor? You say, well, okay, we got grand jury subpoena power, right? Let's look at the MetroCard account. If he's only gone to Chinatown once in the last month and was a committed assault, well, that's to me strong circumstantial evidence. Then let's look at the Facebook accounts, look at the emails, look at the social media. So that's how I'm going to investigate, and doing that in partnership with community groups, because I know that the trust is broken and sometimes folks don't want to come forward, in large part because when they come forward, they defeated that incorrect law and lack of trust by the NYPD spokesperson. So that's what I would do on hate crimes, work in partnership with the community, and really have that approach of starting from a common sense approach and saying, let's find out if it's a hate crime. Let's follow the evidence. The second part is why I went to law school. So, I grew up in Harlem in the 80s during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. I learned about the police. My first interaction was a shootout on my block. My second up close interaction was a gunpoint stop by 3 undercovers on my corner when I was on the way. I was 15 on the way to the store for my dad. I was stopped 2 more times at gunpoint, one by 40 police officers who claimed we stabbed someone in Central Park just a couple of years after the exonerated Central Park 5 were prosecuted. So I know all about community trust. And that's why I went to law school. I've been working on that the last 20 plus years. My first case out of law school, the significance was suing the state police for excessive force on behalf of members of the Onondaga Nation who were having a peaceful political protest. When I was a federal prosecutor, I prosecuted an FBI agent for lying. I'm currently representing Eric Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, in a transparency lawsuit against the mayor. So this is where I live. And that's going to be fundamentally where I govern from. With the community, I tell folks I'm a Harlem Little League coach, while I'm on hiatus this season, and a Sunday school teacher. And that's my whole self. So when I was at the Attorney General's office, that was my hiring philosophy. Give me your whole self. Let me know your whole being, in large part because I think it enriches the office, but also because I want you as an assistant attorney general or as assistant district attorney to look at everyone who comes before you as a whole person, the juror, the person accused of a crime, the defense lawyer, the stenographer. So I think that's fundamentally important. And how do we manifest that? We manifest that in who we hire. I mean, I didn't go to the DA's office on purpose out of law school. I didn't think it reflected where I wanted to be. We need to change that. We need to recruit from people who have been affected, and then we need to promote not just based on arrest numbers and conviction volume, but on just one question: the work you're doing, does it make us safer? And judgment, and so that we can get out some of what I call the churn cases that don't deal with public safety. And then lastly, we need to use the power of the office to stand up for the marginalized. I did this at the Attorney General's office, right? We pioneered may be too strong. We did a lot of really good criminal wage theft work, right? Across industries. We pioneered, I think it's correct in this space, tenant harassment cases, prosecuting landlords who are harassing tenants. So using the criminal marginalized is a big piece, using the power of the office, including in the office, those who've been affected by the system, and telling people to bring their whole selves and all the ways they've been affected by it.
All right, Professor, you have 2 questions.
Yeah.
For Mr. Bragg. Mr. Bragg, you got 2 minutes to answer those 2 questions.
We got a lot of academic firepower on there.
Yeah, that's why I got to keep quiet because the brain trust in here is crazy. So I just like sitting back and listening. It's kind of informative for me. Go ahead, Professor.
Also like female firepower. So I'm a professor at CUNY School of Law, and so my questions first is related to immigration, and so they're yes/no questions. So just not to elaborate because I do want to get to the questions I have for you. Also, by the way, I'm a Harlemite, so prosecutors' decisions impact non-citizen defendants in devastating ways. Would you commit to decline to prosecute or low-level nonviolent offenses?
Yes, I have a declination policy on my website.
Great. So, Then second, do you have a written, so I'm looking at all stages of like prosecutorial decision as it relates to immigrants. If you, will you adopt or have you adopted a written plea policy instructing, would you like instruct sort of your line IDAs to avoid and mitigate immigration consequences in charges and decline to overcharge?
So decline to overcharge is across the board. It's fundamental. We're going to change that, and certainly structuring resolutions of cases mindful of immigration consequences, definitely.
Right. So my question was, would you have a written plea policy?
Yes.
With respect to that?
Yes, I've said it verbally a bunch of times. They don't have a written policy, but as
Okay, so maybe you need to do that so the immigrant community will have some confidence that you will do that. So putting that into writing and putting into different languages. The other question is, there is a conviction integrity unit, and this is really from my colleague Talia Pellet. Would you be open to a expansive immigration integrity unit that would look at the immigration consequences of your prosecutorial decisions, robustly hiring immigration attorneys, and need be using any kind of post-conviction remedies or tools to mitigate immigration consequences? Would you be in favor of such a policy?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm now looking at my website because I think what I just said you might be on there, but that's not, and I will revise it.
Okay. And if you are open to doing that, I definitely, Community Law School will be, we can be a resource for devising an immigration unit. The next question is related, which is about broader prosecutorial discretion. The decision to bring a case or not bring a case impacts our communities of color. Prosecutors make decisions that are not appealable. I mean, it's probably the only actor in our criminal legal system that's not reviewable. Even judges' decisions go up to appeal. So with that in mind, would you agree to community oversight over your prosecutorial power, beginning from the decision to prosecute and throughout the stages of prosecution? And I can give you examples if you're not thinking about it, but overall, would you be willing to have community oversight over your prosecutorial power?
Well, I would say consistent with the professional code of responsibility, which I think makes some of those duties non-delegable. But I'd be happy to hear more on that.
Okay, so just I'll throw out some ideas and we can definitely talk online if you're open to the idea. So for example, having independent experts review decisions. Another one of your candidates said they would create a village community to look at the decisions you're making with respect to prosecution, auditing your decisions after a year, publishing those audits on your website, looking at for racial gender disparity. Those are just some of the examples of community oversight, not on policy. I think we know everyone's but just on the decision to prosecute.
Well, many of the things you said about sort of particularly the audit function and reporting, that is on my website. I think Kim Fox in Chicago is doing a lot of great stuff in that space, and we've adopted a bill in the city council about disclosures that we've said has not passed, but we've said that we would abide by it.
Right.
So
I'm just talking about before you decide, right? Because once you bring charges, immigrant defendants are already then triggered by ICE. So the decision will really be at the outset of prosecution, having either a panel of experts or community input in the decision to prosecute. I've worked with a number of district attorneys first of all, they have no idea about immigration law and the consequences. So just even talking to them at the outset of moving forward. But maybe we can talk offline if you're open to sharing ultimately prosecutorial power, then I think there's a conversation to be had here.
Yeah, I want to hear more about. I'm thinking about obviously some of the grand jury secrecy and some of the kind of things that can't be shared. But I'd be happy to have the conversation.
Right, and then last thing, just because I've not asked this at all, and I will be probably called to task by advocates. The prior Manhattan DA has done already some work in decriminalizing sex work. Most recently with motions to vacate of open prostitution-related offenses. Just to be clear, when we're mentioning sex work, it's voluntary and consensual provision of services, not where there's coercion or trafficking. what more would you do to decriminalize sex work in New York City? And also if you can respond to how it impacts to trans BIPOC folks.
Yeah, so I would tell the next police commissioner that I don't want to work with the Vice Squad. You may be familiar with the ProPublica report from last year, showing just what we already know, the deep racial and national origin discrimination and who they're arresting on both sides, workers and purchasers.
Right.
And I think that type of prosecution, right, which is, again, the sort of churn cases where we're not addressing anything, is not my focus. My focus is what I've done throughout my career, which is, as I said, kind of follow the money, follow the contraband to the most culpable folks, and then we can see some real public safety benefits in our communities. But when you're arresting over 80% of folks are non-white for something that we know that's not the marketplace, that's just foolishness.
Great. And just, would you be open to working with advocates? I know the 440 motion is really for the defendant to expunge or vacate any prostitution-related offenses.
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we have two questions from the audience, but I believe, Mr. Coffey, I think if you have a question, I'd like to hear it. It has to be a brief question, and Mr. Bragg, if you can give us a brief answer to that question, and then I want to get to these two questions from the audience. Mr. Coffey, do you have a brief question?
Hi, Ms. Bragg. My name is Professor Coffey. I teach forensic justice and problem-solving course at New York University. I'm also a formerly incarcerated citizen, and as I shared, I'm here tonight representing that population, along as as well as Black and Brown communities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you already know the gist of it. As the incoming DA, and I'm going to go ahead and say that there. What three promises can you make the Black and Brown communities on your first day in office and coming in that they know, not only just because you're a person of color, that you are genuine in your approach and creating equity and equality within the DA's office that's reflective in our communities that have been disproportionately impacted? I work with men and women who have been.
The AG's report on stop and frisk, showing that only 0.1% of the stops resulted in a conviction for a violent offense. That's historical data. I want to use data in real time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 2015 report from Vera on the Manhattan DA's office. I want to use data in real time so that I can hold my managers accountable. We can't have different outcomes based on race on the same facts. I'm do that in real time. It's a management tool. And the third is on reentry. So reentry is an issue that's very impactful to me broadly, just because it affects so many of my friends. I've also had a loved one live with me for a year plus after he returned from incarceration. I support the Less is More Act. I'm going to push back and take stands on against technical parole. I'm going to have a position of standing with people in their applications for release with the parole board. And when folks get home, as I was tuning in, I heard Xavier asked the last person, what about the use of forfeiture funds? One place where I want to use forfeiture funds is to help those who are returning. I mean, I know this professionally from the work I've done, but I also know it personally through my brother-in-law, the challenges of housing and employment and the convening power of the district attorney. Three specific. I've got a sort of a policy sheet on racial justice on my website that goes into more, basically every policy paper we have. I'm not a deep academic like y'all. I'm just a visiting professor at New York Law School, but I co-run the Racial Justice Project there. Every policy, I'm looking at it from a racial justice perspective, and so it's on all of my policies. But then we did a pull-out paper on just kind of racial justice that is embedded in all the other ones.
And lastly, are you open to having individuals with justice involvement, social workers, academias, and those individuals as a part of that team that helps execute and implement these policies at every level of your office?
Not only am I open to it, I think it's essential for justice.
All right, fantastic. So I got two questions from the audience, and I want to probably better that I just read them. And Alvin, if you can answer the first one, have at it. First question is, in connection with this election, there has been a debate about the DA's office's role in prosecuting white collar crime. There was an op-ed just today on this subject in the Daily News. What is your view of the DA's office as it relates to white collar crime, e.g. the finance industry? Does the DA piggyback on federal DOJ and SEC and state AG prosecutions? Is there a particular niche for DA's race? So basically, what's your position on white collar crime as it relates to your position or your role as a New York County District Attorney, should you get that position?
It's an important part of the role. I mean, Manhattan is special in this way. We've got City Hall and Wall Street. I've worked in this area my entire career. And one of the last cases I oversaw at the Attorney General's office was retirees who were bilked out of their retirement funds by fraudulent conduct by an investment professional. I've also done a lot in the public corruption space, prosecuted 2 mayors, one for bribery, one for campaign finance fraud, the former majority Senate leader for bribery. Is very important. Wall Street and public corruption, I think particularly now in a time of a tightening public fist, the public corruption, and also given what's happened with the Supreme Court law and the federal, really basically saying, look, states, some of this is for states and locals. So it's very, very important. And the last point I make on it is it's related. Some things we think of as white collar, the case I talked about, the business person, it was money laundering. It was a month-long trial. It's a white collar case, but it was money laundering of drug money that was leading to violence. So it was connected to street violence. I did a mortgage fraud trial of a former prosecutor who was a lawyer who was having sham closings. That was the kind of conduct that was the last bubble. It destabilized the neighborhood and led to homelessness and some of the other issues. So I believe it is a part of our kind of public health and public safety enforcement. And we got to have one standard of justice for all. So key to this office.
Okay, second question is, and then we have to give you time for closing statement. How would you build a bridge to engage law enforcement in working with the DA's office to achieve justice for all, especially under the lens of a misinformed application of the law?
I don't know about the last part. I don't know, maybe that's going back to hate crimes when I talk about misapplication. So certainly, one, taking control. We see, I talk about law and order where, the police bring you the case at the 30-minute mark, and it's just fundamentally flawed. One, we can't just reflexively process what the police bring us. But two, something like this hate crimes, you see what the NYPD spokesperson is saying, the DA's got to get involved earlier, and investigate the case properly. And so we need independent, objective reviews, but we also need, for these significant matters, we just named a couple: securities fraud, the hate crimes, one where we're directly interacting with the community, and particularly one where, as I mentioned earlier, the NYPD spokesperson is getting the law wrong.
So I think, so let me rephrase that question. Then you have about 2 minutes to close up. So I think what the question is asking is, there has to be some marriage between the police department and the DA's office, because law enforcement brings cases to the DA's office. I guess the question is, because if there is some type of issues between the DA's office and law enforcement, how do you bring those two bodies together to make sure that justice is being acquired by everybody involved? I think
I've done that throughout my career. Sorry, I misunderstood. While I was prosecuting that FBI agent for lying and obstructing justice, I was also working with the FBI to build cases that focused on public safety. And so I've done that through having lots of uncomfortable conversations, talking about how these police accountability conversations really are for us all. Law enforcement cannot do its job without having community trust. Public safety is the first civil right. So these are inextricably linked. That's kind of been my career. I'm the only candidate in this race who's both a civil rights lawyer and a former prosecutor. So I'm uniquely situated to have that conversation. And also I've lived it both, right? I have had a gun pointed at me 3 times by the NYPD, and I've had a gun pointed at me 3 times by people who were not the police. Our police accountability issues are most acute in our neighborhoods, where we also have real public safety issues. And I have that conversation consistently with law enforcement and community stakeholders, bring together, convene, have challenging conversations and then put together and move forward and work on the real issues.
Okay, so it's 9:26. I think you now have about 90 seconds to 120 seconds to give us a closing statement if you choose to.
I'll just be brief. I've talked a lot about personal experience. I wanted to tie it together because all of my work is rooted in that. I've had a lot of professional experience we've talked about, but when I talk about going back to the first question on defund, when I talk about investment in our community, I'm talking about my dad's work as a homeless shelter, my mom as an educator, my reentry plan, which is on my website. We've got a video of me talking with my brother-in-law. It comes from professional experiences investigating companies that were discriminating on criminal history, but also from my personal experiences with my brother-in-law. Police accountability, that grows out of those early stops. And the fact that I'm also now raising two kids who are approaching the age when I was first stopped at gunpoint by the NYPD. When I talk about addiction, I'm thinking about and building a policy based around my dad's struggles with sobriety. And when I'm thinking about public safety and the kind of cases we need to bring, I'm thinking about having had a knife to my neck, a semi-automatic weapon to my head, and a homicide victim on my doorstep. All my policies are rooted in these real world experiences. I've used them for the last 20 plus years to work on both civil rights and public safety. And that's what I would do as Manhattan District Attorney.
All right, so thank you very much, Alvin. We really appreciate it. Thank the audience out there for listening. Alvin, we appreciate your time. Good luck on your candidacy. And I'm going to give it back to Austin for him to give us our closing statement.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, it's been a long and exciting journey. Thank you to the candidates, but thank you especially to our wonderful panelists. They've dedicated more than 4 hours of their lives, not including the prep time. So thank you for preparing for this and grilling our candidates, because these are really important issues. And I especially want to thank our moderator, Xavier, for doing an amazing job moderating this evening. I would give you a round of applause if we were there in person and you could all hear it. And thanks everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next NYCLA Criminal Justice Section event. Have a wonderful evening.